Good evening, and welcome back to Soft History Stories. Have you ever wondered how a distant trade problem, something as quiet as tea leaves moving across oceans and silver coins changing hands in crowded ports, could slowly grow into a war between two vast empires? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you'd like, let me know where you're listening from tonight and what your local time is. I always enjoy seeing how far these quiet historical journeys travel across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the early 19th century, the world was becoming more connected than it had ever been before. Ships crossed oceans in steady patterns, carrying goods, people, and ideas between continents. Trade networks stretched from Europe to the Americas, from India to Southeast Asia, and deep into the ports of China. What appeared on the surface to be a normal exchange of goods was actually part of a much larger transformation taking place across the global economy. For many European nations, China had long been a place of fascination and wealth. Chinese goods, especially tea, porcelain, and silk, were in extremely high demand across Europe. Tea, in particular, had become part of daily life in Britain. By the late 18th century, millions of people in Britain were drinking it regularly, from wealthy households in London to modest homes in the countryside. This demand meant that British merchants needed a constant supply of Chinese tea arriving by ship each year. But the trade had a serious imbalance. China did not have much interest in the manufactured goods that Europeans offered in return. Chinese merchants preferred payment in silver. Over time, enormous quantities of silver flowed from Europe into China in exchange for Chinese goods. For Britain, this created a growing financial concern. Silver was a valuable resource, and losing so much of it each year was not sustainable in the long run. British merchants and officials began searching for a way to correct this imbalance. They needed something that Chinese buyers would purchase in large quantities, something that could reverse the steady flow of silver leaving Europe. The solution they eventually focused on was opium. Opium was not unknown in China. The substance had been used for centuries in limited medical contexts. Earlier references to it appeared in Chinese texts dating back to the Qing Dynasty. At that time, it was mostly treated as a medicine, often mixed into preparations intended to ease pain or illness. However, the form of opium that entered China in the 18th and 19th centuries was different in scale and use. Instead of occasional medical consumption, opium began to appear in recreational smoking mixtures. The habit gradually spread among certain groups in Chinese society. What had once been rare began to become more common, particularly in coastal trading regions. This shift did not happen overnight. At first, the quantities involved were small. Foreign traders, including merchants from India and Southeast Asia, brought modest amounts of opium into Chinese markets. Over time, however, the trade expanded. The British East India Company, which controlled large territories in India, began to play a central role in producing opium for export. In the fertile plains of Bengal and along the Ganges River, poppy cultivation expanded under British oversight. The East India Company organized a structured system in which opium was grown, processed, and sold through auctions. Merchants purchased the drug and transported it to the Chinese coast, where it entered smuggling networks that distributed it inland. This system created a powerful economic engine. Opium sales generated enormous profits for traders and helped correct Britain's trade deficit with China. Instead of silver flowing one direction from Britain to China, silver now began to move the other way. Chinese buyers were paying for opium, and that silver returned to British merchants who then used it to purchase tea and other goods. From a purely commercial perspective, the system worked. Trade expanded, profits increased, and merchants on both sides of the ocean benefited financially. Yet, the effects inside China were becoming increasingly troubling. As opium became more widely available, its consumption spread beyond wealthy circles. Government officials, merchants, soldiers, laborers, and artisans began using the drug. In many cases, it started casually, but the substance was highly addictive. Once dependency formed, it could be difficult to stop. Communities began noticing changes. Productivity declined among some workers. Families struggled with addiction among relatives. Officials worried that soldiers and administrators who relied on opium might become unreliable in their duties. The issue was not only social but also economic. Large amounts of silver were now leaving China to pay for the drug. This reversal of the silver flow alarmed the Qing government. For generations, the empire had benefited from a steady inflow of silver from international trade. Now the direction was changing. Silver reserves were shrinking, and officials feared that the economy might weaken if the trend continued. At the same time, local authorities along the coast faced a practical problem. The opium trade was technically illegal, but it had grown so profitable that corruption became common. Some merchants paid bribes to avoid enforcement. Certain officials tolerated smuggling because it generated unofficial revenue. Others attempted to enforce bans but struggled against well-organized trading networks. Within the imperial court in Beijing, debate continued over how serious the situation had become. Some advisors believed the problem could be managed through regulation. They argued that limited tolerance might reduce smuggling and allow the government to collect taxes. Others insisted that opium posed a direct threat to society and should be eliminated entirely. Among the most concerned was the Dao Guang emperor. The emperor received reports describing rising addiction and declining silver reserves. These reports suggested that the issue had grown beyond a simple commercial matter. It now touched on the stability of the empire itself. By the late 1830s, the emperor decided that stronger action was necessary. In 1839, he appointed a senior scholar official named Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner and sent him south to the trading port of Canton. Lin Zexu had a reputation for integrity and determination. His task was clear: investigate the opium trade and end it. When Lin arrived in Canton, he found a complex environment. The city was the center of China's foreign commerce, where European traders, Chinese merchants, and government officials interacted daily. Foreign merchants operated from a district known as the 13 Factories, where warehouses, offices, and residences stood along the river. Lin immediately began gathering information. He questioned local officials about the scale of the opium trade and reviewed records of incoming ships. He also addressed Chinese merchants, warning them that the imperial government intended to enforce its prohibition more strictly than before. Foreign traders soon discovered that Lin Siku was serious. He demanded that all merchants surrender their opium stocks. Ships anchored offshore were ordered to turn over their cargo. Foreign traders were temporarily confined to their quarters while negotiations took place. At first, the situation seemed uncertain. British merchants hesitated to comply, hoping that diplomatic pressure might resolve the conflict, but Lin refused to back down. Eventually, British Superintendent Charles Elliot persuaded the merchants to surrender their opium supplies. In total, more than 20,000 chests of opium were handed over to Chinese authorities. The scale of the confiscation was extraordinary. Lin Siku arranged for the drug to be destroyed publicly. Workers opened the chests, mixed the contents with lime and salt water, and washed the mixture into the sea. The process lasted several weeks. It was meant to send a clear message that the Qing government would no longer tolerate the trade. For Chinese officials, this act represented a firm defense of law and morality. For British merchants, however, the destruction of the cargo meant a massive financial loss. The event transformed a commercial dispute into a diplomatic crisis. In Britain, traders demanded compensation for the destroyed opium. Some politicians argued that Chinese authorities had violated property rights. Others believed the incident showed that China treated foreign merchants unfairly. The debate in London gradually shifted from trade policy to questions of national prestige and international law. Before long, discussions about negotiation began giving way to preparations for military action. What had begun as a disagreement over commerce was slowly becoming something much larger. Two very different systems, one shaped by imperial regulation and Confucian political traditions, the other by industrial expansion and global trade, were moving toward confrontation. Neither side fully understood how dramatic the consequences would become. The quiet trade routes that had once carried tea and silk across oceans were now part of a conflict that would soon draw fleets, armies, and entire governments into its path. And in the years ahead, the events that followed would reshape not only relations between Britain and China, but also the balance of power across Asia. By the time Lin Zexu arrived in Canton in 1839, the situation between China and Britain had already been shaped by nearly 3 centuries of expanding global trade. The confrontation that would eventually become the First Opium War did not emerge suddenly. Instead, it grew slowly out of patterns of commerce that had connected Europe and East Asia since the 16th century. During the mid-1500s, maritime trade between Europe and China began to expand in a new and more direct form. Portuguese merchants were among the first Europeans to establish a permanent presence along the southern Chinese coast. In 1557, they received permission from the Qing Dynasty to lease the small peninsula of Macau as a trading outpost. From there, Portuguese ships carried goods between Europe, India, Southeast Asia, and China. Other European nations soon followed. Spanish traders connected China to the newly conquered territories of the Americas through the Manila galleon trade. Beginning in the late 16th century, Spanish ships transported large quantities of silver mined in Mexico and Peru across the Pacific Ocean to the Philippines. From Manila, Chinese merchants exchanged silk, porcelain, and other goods for this silver. The arrival of American silver changed the economic relationship between China and the outside world. The Qing Dynasty and later the Qing Dynasty relied heavily on silver as the basis for taxes and monetary transactions. The new supply from the Americas strengthened China's economy and encouraged international trade. European merchants quickly recognized the opportunity. Chinese products were highly valued in Europe, particularly among wealthy consumers. Porcelain dishes, silk garments, lacquered furniture, and especially tea became fashionable imports. By the 17th century, Chinese tea had spread throughout European society. In Britain, tea drinking gradually became a daily habit across many social classes. The result was a steady flow of Chinese goods traveling westward. In exchange, silver traveled east. For European merchants, this imbalance created a persistent problem. European markets wanted Chinese goods, but China had little demand for European manufactured items. The Qing Empire was largely self-sufficient. Its internal economy produced most of what the population required. As a result, Chinese traders usually insisted on payment in silver bullion rather than foreign products. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, European ships carried increasing amounts of silver into Chinese ports to pay for tea and other goods. In Britain, this created growing concern among merchants and government officials. Silver was essential for maintaining the stability of European currencies and financial systems. Losing large quantities of it through trade raised fears that the imbalance might weaken the national economy. British traders therefore began searching for goods that Chinese buyers might be willing to purchase. The British East India Company played a central role in this search. Founded at the start of the 17th century, the company had gradually become one of the most powerful commercial organizations in the world. By the late 18th century, it controlled large territories in India and operated fleets of ships across Asia. Through its position in India, the company had access to agricultural resources that could be developed for export. Among these resources was the opium poppy. In regions such as Bengal and the Ganges River Valley, poppy cultivation could be organized on a large scale under the supervision of the East India Company. Farmers produced raw opium that was processed into dense cakes suitable for transport. The company itself did not ship opium directly into China. Instead, it sold the drug at auctions in the city of Kolkata. Private merchants purchased the opium and carried it across the Indian Ocean to the Chinese coast. There, it entered a complex system of smuggling and distribution operated by Chinese traders. By the early 19th century, this system had grown into a major commercial network. Ships carrying opium often anchored at offshore islands near the Pearl River Delta, where the entrances to Canton's harbor could be monitored. Chinese dealers then transported the drug inland using smaller vessels and riverboats. Because the trade was technically illegal under Q law, many transactions occurred outside official channels. Despite the prohibition, enforcement proved difficult. Local authorities faced constant pressure from merchants who profited from the trade. Bribes and informal agreements sometimes allowed smuggling operations to continue. At the same time, the demand for opium among Chinese consumers was increasing. As prices fell and supply grew, the drug became more accessible to people beyond elite circles. From the British perspective, the system solved the trade imbalance that had troubled merchants for decades. Silver now flowed out of China in exchange for opium shipments. British traders used that silver to purchase tea and other Chinese goods. The cycle allowed British commerce in East Asia to expand rapidly within China. However, the consequences were becoming increasingly visible. Government officials reported that the outflow of silver was affecting the empire's monetary stability. Taxes collected in silver became harder to obtain. Prices fluctuated in certain regions. Officials worried that these economic effects might weaken the government's ability to manage its finances. The social consequences of widespread opium use were also troubling. Some individuals used the drug occasionally without severe consequences. Others developed strong dependency. Officials reported cases in which workers neglected their duties or soldiers struggled to maintain discipline, although the overall number of addicted users was difficult to measure. The perception of a growing problem spread through official reports and public discussions. The Qing government had already attempted to restrict the drug long before the arrival of Lin Siku. As early as 1729, imperial authorities issued regulations prohibiting the sale of opium for smoking. Later decrees in 1796 and 1799 strengthened these bans. The intention was to prevent the expansion of recreational use and to limit the influence of foreign traders in the drug market, yet enforcement remained inconsistent. The growing profits involved in opium smuggling made the trade resilient. Merchants continued bringing the drug into coastal waters and distribution networks inside China, adapted to avoid detection. By the beginning of the 19th century, the situation had become more complicated due to broader changes in the global economy. The Industrial Revolution was transforming Britain. Factories produced increasing quantities of manufactured goods. British merchants and politicians began advocating for a new economic philosophy often described as free trade. According to this view, international commerce should operate with fewer restrictions, allowing goods to move across borders with minimal interference from governments. China's trade system was organized differently. Foreign merchants were required to conduct business only through Canton, under a structure known as the Canton system. Within this system, a group of licensed Chinese merchants known as the Kohong acted as intermediaries between foreign traders and Qing officials. Foreign merchants could not travel freely inside China or establish direct contact with most government authorities. For British traders, these restrictions were frustrating. They believed that China's market had enormous potential if it were open more widely to foreign commerce. Several diplomatic missions attempted to negotiate new trading arrangements. In 1793, the British government sent Lord George Macartney to China to request expanded commercial privileges. Macartney hoped to persuade the Qing court to open additional ports and establish regular diplomatic relations. The mission reached the imperial court, but the negotiations produced little change. The Qing emperor regarded Britain as a distant trading partner rather than an equal power. The existing Canton system remained in place. A second British embassy led by William Amherst visited China in 1816. This mission also failed to secure new concessions. Cultural misunderstandings and disagreements over diplomatic customs made negotiations difficult. As these attempts failed, British frustration with the trade system continued to grow. Meanwhile, the opium trade expanded further. Private merchants from Britain, the United States, and other nations entered the market. Competition increased the volume of opium arriving in Chinese waters. Prices declined, making the drug easier to obtain for a larger portion of the population. Chinese officials watched these developments with increasing concern. By the 1830s, the amount of opium entering China each year had risen dramatically, compared with earlier decades. The trade that once involved a few thousand chests annually now reached tens of thousands. At the same time, the outflow of silver from China accelerated. Reports presented to the imperial court described a troubling reversal. For centuries, silver had flowed into China from global trade. Now it was leaving the empire to pay for imported opium. This financial shift worried the Dao Guang emperor. He concluded that the problem could no longer be managed through limited enforcement or regional regulation. The trade itself had to be confronted directly. If the opium trade continued unchecked, officials feared that the empire might suffer economic and social instability. The emperor therefore decided to appoint a commissioner with extraordinary authority. Lin Siku was chosen for the task. His mission was not simply to investigate the trade, but to eliminate it. The emperor expected him to confront both foreign merchants and Chinese smugglers. His orders allowed him to impose severe penalties on those who continued participating in the trade. When Lin began his work in Canton, he quickly realized that the situation was larger than many officials in Beijing had understood. The city's foreign quarter contained warehouses filled with goods from across the world. Ships arrived regularly from India and Southeast Asia. Merchants representing multiple nations negotiated deals in offices overlooking the river. Within this environment, the opium trade had become deeply integrated into the structure of international commerce. Stopping it would require decisive action. Lin's decision to confiscate and destroy the opium stocks in 1839 represented the first major step in that effort. For Chinese officials, it was an assertion of sovereignty and a defense of social order. For British merchants, it appeared as the destruction of valuable property and an attack on the principles of international trade. From that moment forward, the dispute between the Qing Empire and Britain began to move beyond commerce alone. What had once been a complicated trade relationship was now becoming a political and diplomatic confrontation, one that would soon draw naval fleets and armies into the waters and ports of southern China. In the years before the conflict began, the city of Canton stood at the center of China's relationship with the outside world. For foreign merchants arriving by sea, it was not only a trading port, but the single authorized gateway into the vast markets of the Qing Empire. Every ship carrying European goods, every cargo of tea destined for London, and every crate of porcelain bound for distant ports passed through this tightly controlled system. The arrangement that governed this commerce was known as the Canton system. The Qing Dynasty had created this structure during the late 17th and early 18th centuries as a way to manage foreign trade without allowing outside influence to spread too far into Chinese society. The imperial government did not oppose trade itself. Commerce had long been part of China's economy, and foreign merchants were welcomed when their activities could be supervised. But the court in Beijing preferred careful limits. Foreign traders were not permitted to move freely through the empire. They were restricted to the southern port of Canton, known today as Guangha. This city sat near the mouth of the Pearl River, one of the great waterways of southern China. Its location made it ideal for maritime trade. Ships arriving from the South China Sea could reach the harbor through channels that local pilots knew well. From the Qing perspective, concentrating foreign merchants in one location made administration easier. Officials could monitor trade, collect taxes, and maintain order without allowing foreigners to travel inland. Within Canton itself, foreign merchants were confined to a specific district along the riverfront. This area was known as the 13 Factories. Despite the name, the buildings were not factories in the modern industrial sense. They were warehouses, offices, and living quarters belonging to different trading companies. British, American, Dutch, and other European merchants rented space in these compounds during the trading season. The district became a busy center of international commerce. Warehouses stored tea, silk, and porcelain, waiting to be loaded onto ships. Clerks kept records of shipments and payments. Sailors, translators, and merchants moved through the narrow streets between the buildings. Yet, even inside this commercial center, foreign traders operated under strict rules. They could not enter the walled city of Canton without permission. They were forbidden from learning the Chinese language in an official capacity. Direct communication with high-ranking Chinese officials was not allowed. Instead, all negotiations passed through a group of licensed Chinese merchants known as the Kohong. The Kohong merchants formed a small but powerful network. These individuals had received special authorization from the Qing government to conduct business with foreigners. When a European trader arrived with a cargo, he was required to deal with one of these Chinese merchants. The Kohong merchant handled many responsibilities at once. He negotiated prices for Chinese goods. He arranged the purchase of foreign cargo. He collected customs fees and ensured that the appropriate taxes reached government officials. In addition, he was responsible for the behavior of the foreign merchants under his supervision. If disputes occurred, the Kohong merchants served as the intermediary who helped resolve them. This system created a carefully balanced relationship between Chinese authorities and foreign traders. It allowed international commerce to continue while maintaining the Qing government's authority over the process. For many years, the arrangement functioned well enough to support large volumes of trade. By the 18th century, European ships were arriving in Canton every year in growing numbers. The British East India Company played the leading role in this commerce. Its ships carried Chinese tea back to Britain, where the drink had become part of everyday life. Tea imports increased steadily. In London, warehouses filled with chests of tea arriving from China. Auctions distributed the product throughout Britain and eventually to markets across Europe and North America. The tea trade alone generated enormous profits for merchants and governments alike. Porcelain and silk also remained popular. Chinese artisans produced fine ceramics that European manufacturers could not easily replicate. Silk textiles continued to attract buyers seeking luxury fabrics. As demand for these goods grew, the Canton system remained the channel through which nearly all of them passed. But from the perspective of many Western merchants, the system had several frustrating limitations. Foreign traders were not allowed to establish permanent diplomatic relations with the Qing court. They could not negotiate directly with officials responsible for imperial policy. Communication had to pass through the Kohong merchants and local administrators in Canton. Furthermore, foreigners could not open trading posts in other Chinese ports. Even though China possessed a long coastline and many prosperous cities, foreign ships were expected to conduct all commerce through the single location authorized by the government. For merchants who believed strongly in expanding international trade, these restrictions appeared unnecessary. In Britain, a new generation of economists had begun promoting the idea that commerce should operate freely across national boundaries. Writers such as Adam Smith argued that fewer restrictions would increase prosperity for all parties involved. Many British merchants embraced these ideas. They believed that China's markets could become far larger if trade barriers were removed. However, the Qing government saw the situation differently. From the imperial court's point of view, foreign merchants were guests allowed to conduct limited business under Chinese supervision. The empire did not depend on foreign trade for its survival. Agriculture, internal commerce, and regional industries provided the foundation of the economy. Maintaining social order and political stability mattered more than expanding international trade. This difference in perspective created a quiet tension between the two systems. British merchants wanted wider access and fewer regulations. Qing officials wanted strict control and careful supervision. For decades, the Canton system managed to balance these competing expectations. But the expansion of the opium trade placed the entire structure under strain. Opium did not move through the same official channels as tea and porcelain. Because the drug was prohibited by Qing law, merchants avoided bringing it directly into Canton's regulated warehouses. Instead, shipments remained anchored offshore or nearby islands where they could be transferred secretly. Chinese dealers then transported the drug inland using smaller vessels. This smuggling network bypassed the Kohong system. As a result, it weakened the ability of the Qing government to supervise foreign commerce. The profits involved were so large that both foreign traders and Chinese smugglers found ways to continue the trade despite repeated bans. For local officials in Canton, the situation became increasingly difficult to manage. On one hand, They were responsible for enforcing imperial laws that prohibited opium. On the other hand, they needed to maintain stable relations with foreign merchants who played an important role in the region's economy. Some officials attempted to enforce the bans strictly. Others tolerated certain activities in exchange for unofficial payments or to avoid disrupting trade entirely. The Kohong merchants themselves faced pressure from both sides. Foreign traders expected them to facilitate business smoothly. Chinese authorities expected them to prevent illegal commerce. When conflicts arose, these merchants had to navigate between the interests of powerful trading companies and the demands of the imperial administration. By the 1830s, the growing scale of the opium trade made these tensions impossible to ignore. Large numbers of chests containing the drug arrived in Chinese waters each year. Silver payments for opium moved steadily out of China. Reports describing addiction among various social groups reached the imperial court. The Daoguang emperor recognized that the existing system could no longer contain the problem. The Canton system had been designed to regulate legitimate commerce. It was not equipped to eliminate a trade that operated largely outside official channels. If stronger action was not taken, the emperor feared that both the economy and the moral order of society might suffer. It was in this environment that Lin Zexu arrived in Canton. Unlike many officials who had tried to manage the problem gradually, Lin approached the situation with determination. He believed that decisive action was necessary to restore control over the port and the surrounding trade networks. His investigations quickly revealed how deeply the opium trade had penetrated the commercial system. Foreign merchants relied on it to correct their trade imbalance. Chinese dealers profited from distributing the drug inland. Local officials struggled to enforce laws while maintaining order in one of the busiest ports in Asia. Lin concluded that partial measures would not succeed. If the trade were allowed to continue even in small amounts, the profits involved would encourage merchants to expand it again. The only solution in his view was to eliminate the supply entirely. His demand that foreign traders surrender their opium stocks was therefore not a temporary negotiation tactic. It was part of a broader effort to restore the authority of the Qing government over international commerce. The destruction of the confiscated opium soon became one of the most dramatic events in the history of global trade. For Chinese officials, it demonstrated that imperial law would be enforced even against powerful foreign merchants. For British traders, it appeared as a direct attack on commercial interests. And for both sides, the event marked the moment when the long-standing structure of regulated trade in Canton began to give way to a much more serious confrontation. The port that had once served as the meeting point of two distant economies was now becoming the place where their disagreements would be settled by entirely different means. While the Canton system shaped the daily experience of foreign merchants in southern China, the deeper forces driving the coming conflict lay far beyond the Pearl River. Across the Indian Ocean in the territories controlled by the British East India Company, a commercial system was developing that would eventually alter the balance of trade between Britain and China. The British East India Company had grown from a trading organization into a powerful governing authority over large parts of the Indian subcontinent. By the late 18th century, it administered vast agricultural regions, collected taxes, and controlled major ports that connected India to global shipping routes. These territories became central to Britain's wider trading network across Asia. Within these lands, the cultivation of the opium poppy expanded steadily. The fertile plains of Bengal and the Ganges River Valley provided ideal conditions for growing the crop. Farmers working under company supervision planted poppies during the winter season. When the plants matured, workers collected the sticky sap from the pods. This raw opium was then processed in company facilities, where it was shaped into dense cakes suitable for long-distance transport. The East India Company maintained strict oversight of the production process. Opium grown in company territories was gathered into government-controlled warehouses and prepared for auction. Merchants from many regions attended these auctions in the city of Kolkata. There they purchased chests of opium that would later be transported to markets across Asia. The company itself avoided direct involvement in the smuggling of the drug into China. Instead, it sold the product to private traders who carried it onward. This arrangement allowed the company to profit from production while maintaining some distance from the final stage of the trade. For merchants, the opportunity was extremely attractive. Ships leaving Indian ports could carry large cargoes of opium across the Bay of Bengal and through the waters of Southeast Asia toward the Chinese coast. The journey followed routes that had long been used for commercial shipping. Once near the Pearl River Delta, the cargo was transferred into the distribution system that had developed around Canton. At sea, specialized vessels known as receiving ships often served as floating warehouses. These ships remained anchored outside the main harbor areas where direct inspection by Chinese authorities was less likely. Smaller boats operated by Chinese traders approached them under cover of night or during busy trading periods. Cargo was transferred quietly from one vessel to another. From there, the opium moved inland along rivers and canals that connected southern China to distant provinces. The network relied on experienced sailors, merchants, and local agents who understood how to avoid detection. By the early 19th century, this system had grown into a major commercial enterprise. Each chest of opium represented a valuable commodity. The profits from selling it in China could exceed the cost of production many times over. For merchants willing to accept the risks involved in smuggling, the potential rewards were considerable. The scale of the trade increased year by year. In the late 18th century, annual shipments into China were measured in a few thousand chests. By the 1830s, the number had risen dramatically. Tens of thousands of chests entered Chinese waters each year. The steady increase reflected both rising demand and the growing efficiency of the trade network. The economic effect of this expansion was immediate. Silver began to flow out of China in significant quantities as buyers paid for the drug. British merchants used that silver to purchase tea and other goods that would be shipped to Europe. In this way, the opium trade solved the financial imbalance that had troubled British commerce for decades. For British traders and company officials, the system appeared to function effectively. It connected agricultural production in India with consumer demand in China. It supported shipping networks that linked multiple regions of Asia. And it generated profits that strengthened Britain's commercial presence in the global economy. Yet, this success also created a growing problem for the Qing government. Reports reaching Beijing described a steady outflow of silver from Chinese markets. This shift threatened the stability of the monetary system that depended heavily on silver as a medium of exchange. Officials feared that if the trend continued, it could weaken the empire's finances. Equally troubling were the social consequences associated with opium consumption. Some users treated the drug as a luxury or occasional recreation. Others became dependent on it. Local administrators reported that addiction was appearing among various groups within society. Artisans, laborers, and even some members of the administrative class were said to be using the drug regularly. The situation alarmed many officials who believed that widespread opium use could undermine discipline within government institutions and the military. The Qing court had already issued several decrees banning the importation and sale of opium. These laws were intended to protect the population from addiction and to prevent economic disruption caused by the loss of silver. However, enforcing these laws proved extremely difficult. China's coastline was long, and foreign ships possessed the mobility to anchor in locations beyond the immediate reach of coastal patrols. Smugglers developed methods for transferring cargo quickly and quietly. Even when authorities intercepted shipments, the profits involved encouraged traders to continue their activities. At the same time, corruption complicated enforcement efforts. Some officials responsible for policing the trade accepted payments to overlook certain activities. Others lacked the resources necessary to monitor busy ports effectively. As the opium trade expanded, the gap between official law and actual practice became increasingly visible. Within the imperial court, debates over the appropriate response continued. One group of advisors argued that the government should regulate the trade rather than attempt to eliminate it entirely. They believed that legalization combined with taxation might reduce smuggling and allow the state to recover lost revenue. Another group insisted that legalization would only worsen the problem. In their view, the moral and social consequences of widespread addiction were too serious to tolerate. They argued that the empire must enforce its prohibition decisively. The Dao Guang emperor listened carefully to these arguments. Over time, he became convinced that stronger action was necessary. The reports describing silver shortages and growing addiction suggested that the issue was not limited to a single region. It had become a matter affecting the stability of the entire empire. The emperor therefore began searching for an official capable of addressing the problem with determination. Lin Zhu emerged as the candidate best suited for the task. Lin was known for his reputation as a principled administrator. During his career, he had served in several government positions where he had demonstrated a willingness to confront corruption and enforce imperial law. His record suggested that he possessed both the discipline and the authority needed for a difficult mission. In 1839, the emperor appointed Lin as imperial commissioner and ordered him to travel to Canton. The instructions he carried were clear. He was to investigate the opium trade thoroughly, punish those involved in smuggling, and ensure that foreign merchants understood the seriousness of the prohibition. When Lin reached Canton, he entered a city that had become one of the busiest trading centers in Asia. Foreign merchants operated from their compounds along the river. Chinese traders managed warehouses filled with goods destined for ships bound for distant markets. Small boats moved constantly across the water, carrying cargo between anchored vessels and the docks. The city's prosperity depended heavily on international commerce. But beneath this surface of busy trade, Lin quickly discovered that the opium market had become deeply entrenched. The networks distributing the drug extended far beyond the port itself. They involved merchants, sailors, and local intermediaries who had developed efficient methods for moving the substance throughout the region. Lin recognized that addressing the problem would require decisive action rather than gradual reform. He began by issuing proclamations that reminded Chinese citizens of the existing laws against opium use and distribution. Dealers and smugglers were warned that severe penalties awaited those who continued their activities. He also turned his attention toward the foreign merchants whose cargo supplied the trade. Letters were sent demanding that all opium stocks be surrendered. Lin insisted that foreign traders respect Chinese law while operating within Chinese territory. The demand placed British and American merchants in a difficult position. The drug they possessed represented enormous financial value. Surrendering it would mean accepting heavy losses. Refusing to comply, however, risked provoking direct confrontation with Chinese authorities. The negotiations that followed moved slowly. Foreign merchants hoped that diplomatic pressure from their governments might lead to a compromise. Lin, however, showed little interest in partial solutions. From his perspective, the issue was simple. The opium trade violated imperial law and threatened the stability of society. Therefore, it had to end. The confrontation that developed in Canton during the spring of 1839 soon became one of the defining moments in the relationship between China and the Western trading powers. When Lin Zexu finally secured the surrender of the opium cargoes and arranged for their destruction, he believed he had successfully enforced the emperor's orders. But the consequences of that decision were already beginning to unfold far beyond the shores of southern China. In Britain, merchants who had lost valuable cargo demanded compensation. Politicians began debating whether the destruction of the opium should be treated as a commercial dispute or as an offense against national interests. As the 1830s progressed, the opium trade continued to expand across China in ways that alarmed officials throughout the Qing Empire. What had once been confined to limited coastal circles gradually moved inland along rivers, canals, and overland trading routes. By the time Commissioner Lin Seku arrived in Canton, the problem had become visible across multiple layers of Chinese society. The spread of opium use followed the same networks that had long supported commerce in China. Merchants carried goods along the Grand Canal, through the Yangtze River basin and across the southern provinces. These transportation routes connected distant cities and markets that had been trading with one another for centuries. As opium moved along these channels, it reached communities that had previously encountered the drug only rarely. At first, smoking opium remained associated with wealth and leisure. Some members of the elite class adopted the habit as a fashionable indulgence. Elaborate pipes, decorated trays, and carefully prepared mixtures became part of a ritualized practice in certain social circles. The act of smoking was sometimes described as a refined pastime, similar to drinking tea or enjoying poetry in quiet company. But the habit did not remain confined to elite households. As the availability of opium increased and prices gradually declined, more people began experimenting with it. Artisans, traders, boatmen, and laborers encountered the drug in taverns and private gatherings. What had once been rare slowly became familiar for many individuals. The experience began casually. A person might try opium occasionally in the company of friends or colleagues. Some users continued to consume it infrequently, without severe consequences. Others found themselves drawn into repeated use. The physical effects of the drug created a cycle that was difficult to escape. When consumed, opium produced a sense of calm and relaxation. Pain seemed to fade, worries felt distant, and time passed quietly. Yet repeated use gradually produced dependency. When the body became accustomed to the substance, the absence of it could bring discomfort. Users described chills, nausea, and muscle pain when they attempted to stop. The desire to relieve these symptoms often led them back to the drug. For families and local communities, these patterns could create serious challenges. A worker who became dependent on opium might struggle to maintain regular employment. Household savings might be spent on purchasing the drug. In some cases, families found themselves caring for relatives who could no longer perform their usual responsibilities. Officials responsible for local administration began reporting these developments to higher authorities. Memorials sent to the imperial court described villages where opium smoking had become common. Military officers warned that some soldiers had adopted the habit. Administrators worried that government clerks and minor officials might also be affected. The Qing state relied on disciplined bureaucrats and reliable soldiers to maintain order across a vast territory. If addiction weakened these institutions, the consequences could be significant. At the same time, the economic effects of the trade were becoming increasingly visible. Silver coins had long circulated throughout China as a medium of exchange for taxes, salaries, and commercial transactions. But as more silver flowed out of the country to pay for imported opium, shortages began appearing in certain regions. Merchants sometimes found it harder to obtain the silver needed for large transactions. Farmers paying taxes in silver felt the pressure when the metal became scarce. Officials responsible for managing local finances worried that the imbalance might spread further. The imperial court in Beijing received a growing number of reports describing these problems. Some advisors emphasized the economic threat. Others focused on the moral and social consequences of widespread addiction. Together, these concerns created a sense that the opium trade was undermining the foundations of Qing governance. The Daoguang emperor responded with increasing seriousness. Imperial edicts reminded officials that the use and distribution of opium were illegal. Those caught trafficking the drug could face severe punishment. In some cases, the penalties included exile, imprisonment, or even execution. Yet, despite these measures, the trade continued. Smugglers adapted quickly to new enforcement efforts. When authorities increased patrols in one harbor, traders shifted their operations to another. Receiving ships anchored further offshore, cargo transfers occurred at night or in remote inlets. Chinese dealers also played an important role in maintaining the supply. Unlike foreign merchants, Chinese traders could travel freely through the interior of the empire. They used established commercial routes to distribute opium far from the coastal ports. This made it difficult for authorities to track the movement of the drug once it entered the country. The involvement of Chinese merchants complicated the situation for the government. Officials understood that the trade depended not only on foreign suppliers, but also on domestic participants. Punishing local smugglers risked provoking unrest in regions where many people depended on commerce for their livelihood. Still, the imperial court believed that decisive action was necessary. In 1810, the Daoguang emperor issued a proclamation describing opium as a poison that undermined the customs and moral order of the empire. The edict warned that anyone involved in importing or distributing the drug would face strict penalties. Despite this declaration, the scale of the trade continued to increase during the following decades. By the early 1830s, annual imports of opium into China had reached levels far higher than earlier officials had imagined possible. Tens of thousands of chests arrived each year. The value of the cargo represented a large share of the total trade between China and foreign merchants. The rising numbers convinced many officials that earlier enforcement efforts had failed. The emperor therefore turned to stronger measures. When Linu received his appointment as imperial commissioner, he understood that the situation required both determination and careful planning. His mission was not simply to punish individual smugglers, but to disrupt the entire network that supported the trade. Upon arriving in Canton, Lin began by studying the structure of the opium market. He gathered information from local officials, merchants, and translators familiar with foreign trade. Records from customs offices revealed patterns in shipping arrivals. Testimonies from arrested smugglers helped map the distribution routes used inside China. The investigation showed how deeply the drug had become integrated into everyday commerce. Opium shipments often arrived alongside legitimate cargo such as cotton cloth, spices, and metal goods. Foreign traders relied on the profits from the drug to finance their purchases of Chinese products. Chinese intermediaries earned income by moving the cargo inland. Breaking this system would not be easy. Lin nevertheless believed that a clear demonstration of imperial authority could change the situation. If the government showed that it was prepared to enforce the law decisively, merchants might reconsider the risks of continuing the trade. His first actions targeted Chinese dealers. Those caught distributing opium faced immediate punishment. Lin ordered arrests and confiscations throughout the region. Officials were instructed to search warehouses, riverboats, and storage facilities where the drug might be hidden. At the same time, Lin addressed the foreign merchants who supplied the market. He issued a formal proclamation demanding that all foreign traders surrender their opium stocks. The document explained that the Qing government would no longer tolerate the presence of the drug in Chinese territory. Anyone who refused to comply could face severe consequences. Foreign merchants quickly realized that the commissioner was serious. The pressure placed them in a difficult position. The opium carros stored in their warehouses represented enormous financial value. Surrendering them meant accepting large losses. Yet, resisting Lin's demands risked provoking direct confrontation with Chinese authorities. British Superintendent Charles Elliot eventually advised the merchants to comply with Lin's order. He believed that surrendering the opium might prevent a more serious conflict. Elliot also promised that the British government would consider compensating merchants for their losses. Under this arrangement, more than 20,000 chests of opium were turned over to Chinese officials. Lin organized the destruction of the drug in a carefully supervised process outside Canton. Workers opened each chest and mixed the contents with lime and cedar. The resulting mixture was washed into the ocean through specially prepared channels. The destruction continued for several weeks. For Chinese observers, the event symbolized the government's determination to defend the country from a harmful trade. Officials praised Lin Siku for enforcing the emperor's command with discipline and resolve. Foreign merchants, however, viewed the situation differently. To them, the confiscated cargo represented private property worth millions of dollars. The loss created immediate financial consequences for trading companies in both Asia and Europe. The dispute that followed soon extended beyond the merchants involved. In Britain, the question arose whether the Chinese government had violated the rights of British subjects. Some politicians argued that China had acted unjustly toward foreign traders. Others questioned the morality of the opium trade itself. The debate continued as news of the destruction reached London. What had begun as an effort by the Qing government to enforce its laws was now becoming part of a much larger argument about commerce, sovereignty, and international relations. And while those discussions unfolded in distant capitals, the situation along the southern coast of China continued to grow more tense. As the destruction of the opium cargo outside Canton came to an end in the summer of 1839, the Qing government believed that it had taken a decisive step toward restoring order in the empire's trade system. Commissioner Lin Zexu reported to the Dao Guang Emperor that the illegal drug had been removed from the warehouses of foreign merchants and that a firm warning had been delivered to those who had previously supplied it. From the imperial court's perspective, the action was justified and necessary. For years, the government had issued edicts prohibiting the importation of opium. Those laws were part of the emperor's responsibility to protect the moral well-being of the population and to maintain the economic stability of the empire. The destruction of the confiscated cargo therefore represented the enforcement of an existing law rather than the creation of a new one. Yet the same event appeared very different to many merchants and officials in Britain. The opium destroyed under Lin's 6 orders had been purchased legally at auctions in British-controlled India. Private traders had invested large amounts of money in transporting it across the seas to the Chinese coast. To them, the cargo represented valuable commercial property. When news of its destruction reached British trading circles, anger followed quickly. Merchants who had surrendered their chests of opium expected compensation for the losses they had accepted under pressure from the Chinese authorities. They turned to Superintendent Charles Elliot, the British official responsible for overseeing trade in China, asking how the situation would be resolved. Elliot had encouraged them to hand over the cargo in order to prevent an immediate confrontation with Lin Zexu. Now he faced the difficult task of explaining the consequences. In a formal statement, Elliot promised that the British government would compensate merchants for the surrendered opium. The statement was intended to reassure traders that their cooperation would not result in permanent financial ruin. But this promise also carried political implications. If the British government accepted responsibility for paying the merchants, it might seek reimbursement from China. The destruction of the cargo could then be interpreted not merely as law enforcement, but as an act that required diplomatic response. As reports continued arriving in Britain, the debate expanded beyond the trading community. Some members of Parliament argued that the Chinese government had treated British subjects unfairly. They believed that Britain should defend the interests of its merchants and ensure that British trade could continue without interference. Others expressed a different view. Several critics of the opium trade had long argued that selling the drug in China was morally questionable. They believed that British merchants were profiting from addiction in another country, and that the destruction of the opium was therefore understandable. Among the most vocal critics was William Gladstone, a politician who later became Prime Minister of Britain. Gladstone condemned the trade openly in Parliament. He described it as harmful and unjust, and he warned that military action taken to protect it would damage Britain's reputation. These disagreements revealed a deep division in British public opinion. For merchants and their supporters, the central issue involved property rights and the principle of free trade. If Chinese authorities could seize and destroy goods belonging to foreign traders, they argued, then British commerce across Asia might be threatened. For critics of the trade, the issue involved moral responsibility. They questioned whether Britain should defend a commercial activity that many observers believed was damaging Chinese society. In their view, protecting the opium trade would mean using national power to preserve a harmful business. While these arguments unfolded in London, the situation in southern China continued to grow more tense. Lin Zexu had not only destroyed the opium stocks, but had also introduced new regulations intended to prevent the trade from returning. Foreign merchants were asked to sign agreements promising that they would never again bring opium into Chinese territory. The agreements included severe penalties. Anyone caught violating the prohibition could face execution under Chinese law. Lin insisted that both Chinese smugglers and foreign traders would be subject to the same punishment if they continued the trade. For foreign merchants accustomed to operating under their own legal traditions, the demand created concern. Many believed that Chinese courts would treat them unfairly if disputes arose. They preferred to be judged according to the laws of their own countries rather than those of the Qing Empire. This difference in legal expectations added another layer of tension to the already fragile relationship between Chinese authorities and foreign traders. At the same time, smaller incidents along the southern coast contributed to the growing mistrust. In one case, a group of British sailors became involved in a violent altercation with local residents near Kowloon. A Chinese villager died during the incident. Lin Siku demanded that the sailors responsible be handed over to Chinese authorities for trial. Superintendent Elliot refused. He believed that British subjects should not be tried under Chinese law, which he feared might impose harsh punishments without procedures familiar to British courts. Instead, Elliot arranged for the sailors to be tried before a British naval tribunal. To Chinese officials, this decision appeared to undermine their authority. If foreign citizens could commit crimes in Chinese territory without facing Chinese courts, it raised serious questions about sovereignty. Lin regarded Elliot's refusal as evidence that foreign merchants were unwilling to respect the laws of the Qing Empire. Meanwhile, other events along the coast further strained relations. Chinese authorities restricted the sale of food and supplies to British ships anchored near the Pearl River. The measure was intended to pressure foreign merchants into complying fully with the new anti-opium regulations. British crews responded by sending armed boats to purchase provisions directly from local villages. These encounters sometimes produced brief exchanges of gunfire between British sailors and Chinese coastal defenses. Though limited in scale, the incidents revealed how quickly tensions could escalate when both sides felt that their authority was being challenged. By the autumn of 1839, the situation had reached a delicate stage. Trade between China and Britain had slowed significantly. Foreign merchants remained uncertain about whether they would be allowed to resume normal commercial activities. Chinese officials continued enforcing the prohibition against opium while watching the foreign ships anchored offshore. In London, the British government began considering its options. Some policymakers believed that a diplomatic solution might still be possible. Others argued that China's treatment of British merchants required a stronger response. The question before the government was not simply about the opium trade itself. It also involved the broader issue of how Britain should conduct its relations with a powerful empire that maintained very different legal traditions and economic policies. If negotiations failed, military force might become one of the tools used to resolve the dispute. During these months, preparations quietly began. The British government examined the possibility of sending naval forces to Chinese waters. The Royal Navy already maintained ships in Asia to protect trade routes and suppress piracy. Reinforcing this presence would allow Britain to exert pressure if negotiations with the Qing government broke down. At the same time, merchants and political supporters continued urging the government to defend their interests. They argued that the destruction of the opium cargo had created a precedent that threatened the security of British commerce if Chinese authorities could seize British property without consequence. They warned similar actions might occur in other regions where British traders operated for the Qing court in Beijing. However, the matter appeared far simpler. From their perspective, the government had enforced its laws against an illegal and harmful trade. The responsibility for the conflict rested with those who had attempted to bring the prohibited substance into Chinese territory. These contrasting interpretations made compromise increasingly difficult. As winter approached in 1839, ships of the Royal Navy began preparing for a voyage toward the Chinese coast. The possibility of negotiations still existed, but military plans were moving forward quietly. The confrontation that had begun with the destruction of opium chests outside Canton was gradually expanding into something much larger. Soon, fleets and soldiers would arrive to transform a commercial dispute into a full military conflict between two distant empires. As tensions deepened during 1839, the presence of foreign ships along the southern coast of China began to change the atmosphere. In the Pearl River Delta, What had once been a busy commercial region filled with merchant vessels now felt increasingly uncertain. Chinese officials watched the anchored ships carefully, while foreign traders waited to see whether normal commerce would resume or whether the situation might move toward open confrontation. At the center of these developments remained Commissioner Lin Zexu. Lin's position in Canton was not merely administrative. The Daoguang Emperor had sent him south with exceptional authority, and his instructions were clear. The opium trade was to be eliminated, and the laws of the empire were to be enforced without hesitation. Lin believed strongly that the stability of Chinese society depended on stopping the flow of the drug. From the moment he arrived in Canton, Lin began reorganizing the local administration to strengthen enforcement. Officials responsible for customs inspections were ordered to examine incoming cargo carefully. Patrols along the coast were increased, and local authorities were instructed to investigate suspected smugglers operating along rivers and canals. The commissioner also issued public notices warning that those involved in distributing opium would face severe punishment. These measures were intended not only to enforce the law, but also to demonstrate the seriousness of the imperial government's intentions. Lin understood that the opium trade had grown powerful, partly because many merchants believed that enforcement would remain weak. If the government showed that it was prepared to act decisively, he hoped that traders might abandon the business rather than risk the consequences. At the same time, Lin addressed the foreign merchants whose ships supplied the market. He believed that many of them had misunderstood China's position on the trade. In their view, opium had become another commodity exchanged through international commerce. In Lin's view, it remained a prohibited substance that threatened the well-being of the population. To make this point clear, Lin wrote a formal letter addressed to Queen Victoria of Britain. The document appealed directly to the British monarch's sense of fairness. Lin explained that China had long permitted foreign merchants to trade freely in legitimate goods such as tea and silk. In return, he argued, those merchants should respect Chinese law when conducting business in Chinese territory. The letter questioned how Britain could allow its traders to sell a harmful drug abroad, while the same substance was restricted at home. Lin's message was written carefully and respectfully. He hoped that the British government might recognize the problem and assist in ending the trade voluntarily. According to his reasoning, cooperation between the two countries could preserve peaceful relations while protecting Chinese society from further harm. However, the letter never reached Queen Victoria. Historical accounts suggest that it was either lost during transit or intercepted before it could be delivered to the British court. As a result, the appeal Lin intended as a diplomatic gesture did not influence the decisions being debated in London. Meanwhile, the commissioner continued strengthening enforcement within Canton. Foreign merchants were required to sign formal agreements promising that they would not bring opium into Chinese waters again. The documents included strict language stating that any future violation would carry severe penalties. A few merchants agreed to the terms, others hesitated. They feared that signing such agreements might expose them to legal risks if disputes arose later. Superintendent Charles Elliot advised British traders not to accept the conditions, arguing that they placed foreign merchants under the direct authority of Chinese law. This disagreement widened the divide between the two sides. Lin regarded the refusal to sign the agreements as evidence that foreign traders intended to continue the opium trade secretly. Elliot interpreted Lin's demands as excessive and incompatible with the legal protections expected by British subjects abroad. During the same period, small incidents along the coast continued to create additional tension. In one encounter near Kowloon, British sailors searching for supplies came into contact with Chinese coastal forces. The situation developed into a brief exchange of gunfire. Although the clash was limited, it demonstrated how quickly misunderstandings could escalate when both sides were already suspicious of each other's intentions. Chinese officials reported the incident to the imperial court as evidence that foreign ships were behaving aggressively near Chinese territory. British commanders described the same event as a defensive action taken when their crews were prevented from purchasing food and water. These conflicting interpretations reflected the broader communication difficulties between the two governments. Cultural differences played a role in these misunderstandings. The Qing Dynasty operated under a system in which foreign states were traditionally treated as tributary partners rather than diplomatic equals. Western nations, on the other hand, expected to conduct relations according to principles of sovereign equality between states as trade disputes increased. These differing assumptions became more visible. While Chinese authorities believed they were enforcing domestic laws within their own territory, British officials often interpreted the same actions as obstacles to international commerce. Throughout the late months of 1839, foreign ships remained anchored near the Pearl River, waiting for instructions from their governments. Merchants hoped that a diplomatic settlement might allow trade to resume under new arrangements. Chinese officials hoped that the absence of opium shipments would gradually restore order. Yet behind these hopes, preparations were quietly advancing on both sides in Britain. Political leaders were reviewing reports sent from Canton by Superintendent Elliot and other observers. These reports described the destruction of the opium cargo, the restrictions placed on British merchants, and the growing tension along the coast. Some ministers concluded that the British government should respond firmly to protect the interests of its traders. Naval forces were already present in Asian waters. Reinforcements could be sent if the situation required stronger pressure. Discussions began about how such a force might be used if negotiations with the Qing government failed. Meanwhile, Lin Zhu continued his efforts to strengthen Chinese defenses. Although China possessed a large navy on paper, many of its vessels were designed primarily for river patrol rather than open ocean warfare. Coastal forts guarded important harbors and artillery units protected key approaches to the Pearl River. Lin ordered repairs to several fortifications and increased the readiness of local military units. His intention was not necessarily to begin a war, but to ensure that Chinese authorities could respond if foreign ships attempted to challenge the government's authority. Despite these preparations, Lin remained confident that the situation could be resolved through determination rather than conflict. In his reports to the emperor, he expressed the belief that foreign merchants ultimately depended on Chinese trade for their profits. If the Qing government demonstrated that it would not tolerate the opium trade, he reasoned, the merchants would eventually comply. This confidence reflected the traditional understanding of China's place in the world. For centuries, foreign traders had come to Chinese ports seeking valuable goods. The Qing Empire had remained largely self-sufficient and politically stable during that time. Many officials assumed that the same pattern would continue. Yet the global balance of power had begun to shift. Industrialization had transformed the economies of several European nations. Steam-powered ships, modern artillery, and new manufacturing techniques were gradually altering the nature of international trade and warfare. These developments were not yet fully understood by many officials in Beijing. As winter approached at the end of 1839, the situation along the southern coast remained uncertain. Commissioner Lin Zexu had successfully eliminated the opium stock stored in Canton and had forced foreign merchants to suspend the trade temporarily. From the perspective of the Qing government, the law had been enforced and order restored. But far beyond the Pearl River Delta, decisions were being made that would soon bring a different kind of pressure to Chinese shores. Ships were gathering in distant ports. Orders were being prepared, and the quiet waters of southern China were about to see the arrival of a new phase in the long dispute between two empires. By the spring of 1839, the confrontation between Commissioner Lin Zexu and the foreign merchants in Canton had reached a decisive moment. For several weeks, the merchants had been confined within their trading district, while negotiations continued. Lin's position remained consistent throughout these discussions. The opium trade had violated imperial law, and the only acceptable outcome was the complete surrender of all opium stocks held by foreign traders. The merchants faced a difficult calculation. Their warehouses and ships contained enormous quantities of the drug. Each chest represented a significant investment made by trading firms in India and Britain. Losing those goods meant accepting financial losses that could reach millions of silver dollars. At the same time, refusing Lin's demand risked escalating the crisis further. Chinese officials had already demonstrated that they were prepared to isolate the foreign factories and restrict supplies. Superintendent Charles Elliot believed that confrontation with Chinese authorities at this stage would lead to greater danger for the merchants under his supervision. Many of them were living inside Canton with limited protection, surrounded by Chinese troops enforcing Lin's restrictions. Elliot concluded that surrendering the opium cargo was the safest immediate solution. After several days of negotiation, the foreign merchants agreed. More than 20,000 chests of opium were handed over to Chinese officials. The quantity was enormous. Each chest weighed roughly 140 pounds, meaning that thousands of tons of the drug were now under the control of the Qing authorities. Lin Siku prepared to destroy the confiscated opium in a carefully organized operation. The destruction site was located near Human, a strategic point along the Pearl River estuary. This location was chosen both for practical reasons and for symbolic effect. The river was the gateway through which foreign goods entered southern China, and destroying the opium there would demonstrate that the government intended to close that gateway to the illegal trade. Workers constructed large trenches along the shoreline. The chests of opium were opened and emptied into the pits. Lime and salt water were mixed with the drug, breaking down the thick substance into a slurry that could no longer be used. Once the mixture had dissolved, channels carried the liquid waste into the sea. The process lasted several weeks. Officials supervised every stage to ensure that none of the opium could be recovered. Lin wanted the destruction to serve as a public demonstration of imperial authority. Local residents and officials witnessed the operation, reinforcing the message that the Qing government would enforce its laws against the drug. In his reports to the emperor, Lin described the event as a victory for the rule of law. From the Qing perspective, the action was entirely justified. The opium had been brought illegally into Chinese territory, and its destruction represented the enforcement of long-standing prohibitions. Lin believed that once foreign merchants saw that China would not tolerate the trade, they would abandon it and return to legitimate commerce. But the event had very different consequences outside China. For British merchants, the destruction of the opium cargo created an immediate financial crisis. The goods had been surrendered under pressure, and many traders now expected compensation for their losses. Superintendent Elliot had promised that the British government would consider reimbursing them, but that promise raised a larger political question. If the British government paid compensation, it might demand repayment from China. This possibility quickly became part of the debate unfolding in London. Reports describing the destruction of the opium reached Britain during the latter half of 1839. Newspapers published accounts from merchants who described their losses in dramatic terms. Some writers argued that China had treated British subjects unfairly, and that the British government should respond firmly. At the same time, other voices expressed concern about the moral dimension of the trade. Critics pointed out that opium was widely recognized as a dangerous drug. Selling it in China while restricting its use at home created an uncomfortable contradiction. Several politicians warned that defending the trade might damage Britain's reputation. Despite these concerns, commercial pressure remained strong. Trading firms that had invested heavily in the opium market demanded protection from their government. They argued that British merchants operating abroad should be able to rely on diplomatic and military support if their property was seized. Meanwhile, the situation in Canton remained tense. Although the opium had been destroyed, other disagreements continued to divide Chinese officials and foreign traders. Lin Siku insisted that merchants sign agreements promising never again to import opium. British officials resisted signing such agreements because they believed it would place their citizens fully under Chinese law. These legal disagreements reflected deeper differences between the two societies. In the Qing system, foreigners trading within Chinese territory were expected to obey imperial laws without exception. In the British system, merchants often expected their own government to protect them from the legal authority of other states. Neither side was prepared to accept the other's interpretation easily. Smaller incidents soon added further strain to the relationship. In one case, a group of British sailors became involved in a violent altercation with Chinese villagers near Kowloon. A Chinese resident was killed during the incident. Lin Zexu demanded that the sailors responsible be handed over for trial under Chinese law. Superintendent Elliot refused the request. He feared that Chinese courts might impose severe punishment that British authorities considered unjust. Instead, Elliot arranged for the sailors to be tried before a British naval tribunal. To Chinese officials, this decision appeared to undermine their sovereignty. If foreigners could commit crimes on Chinese soil without facing Chinese justice, it suggested that foreign governments believed themselves above the law. Lin viewed Elliot's refusal as a serious challenge to the authority of the Qing state. At the same time, restrictions placed on British merchants in Canton continued to cause frustration. Chinese authorities limited the sale of food and supplies to foreign ships anchored near the coast. The measure was intended to pressure the merchants into complying fully with Lin's anti-opium policy. British crews responded by attempting to purchase provisions directly from local villages, sometimes using armed boats to reach the shore. These encounters occasionally produced brief exchanges of gunfire between British sailors and Chinese patrols. Although the skirmishes were small, they revealed how quickly tensions could escalate when both sides believed their authority was being challenged. Each incident was reported back to the respective governments, often in ways that emphasized the grievances of one side while overlooking the concerns of the other. By the end of 1839, the relationship between Britain and China had entered a dangerous phase. The destruction of the opium cargo had solved the immediate problem of the drugs stored in Canton, but it had also created a diplomatic dispute that neither government found easy to resolve. Merchants demanded compensation. Officials argued about legal authority, and naval commanders watched the situation closely. Far away in Britain, discussions within the government were beginning to shift towards stronger measures. Naval forces already stationed in Asian waters could be reinforced if necessary. The Royal Navy possessed ships that were faster and more heavily armed than most vessels available to the Qing Empire. If negotiations failed, these ships might be used to apply pressure along the Chinese coast. For the moment, however, the two sides remained in an uneasy standoff. Commissioner Lin Zexu believed that his decisive action had restored control over the opium trade. British merchants believed they had been treated unjustly and awaited a response from their government. Neither side fully realized how close they were to the beginning of open war. The quiet destruction of thousands of opium chests beside the Pearl River had marked the end of one stage of the crisis. What followed next would bring ships, soldiers, and the growing power of industrial nations directly into Chinese waters. By the end of 1839, the conflict between Britain and the Qing Empire had moved beyond the stage of local disputes in Canton. News of the destruction of the opium cargo and the restrictions placed on British merchants had traveled across oceans and reached political leaders in London. What had begun as a disagreement between traders and a provincial commissioner was now becoming a question of national policy. The British government faced pressure from several directions. Merchants who had lost valuable cargo demanded compensation. Trading companies argued that their investments had been destroyed under coercion. They insisted that the government defend the rights of British subjects engaged in overseas commerce. Newspapers in London reported the events in Canton with growing attention, and the issue gradually entered the wider political debate. At the same time, not everyone in Britain supported a forceful response. Some politicians believed that the opium trade itself was morally troubling. They argued that the Chinese government had acted within its rights to prohibit a harmful drug inside its territory. From their perspective, using military power to protect such commerce could damage Britain's reputation. Parliament therefore faced a difficult decision. Should Britain treat the destruction of the opium as a commercial dispute requiring negotiation? Or should it respond with stronger measures to protect its merchants? Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston gradually became one of the most influential voices in the debate. Palmer believed that Britain needed to defend the principle that its citizens could trade abroad without facing arbitrary interference. While he did not openly defend the opium trade itself, he argued that the actions of the Chinese authorities had humiliated British merchants and disrupted international commerce. To Palmean and his supporters, the issue was no longer limited to opium. It had become a matter of national prestige and diplomatic equality. European nations expected to conduct relations with other states through negotiations between recognized governments. The Qing system, however, still treated foreign traders as guests operating under Chinese authority, rather than representatives of sovereign nations. This difference in diplomatic expectations played an important role in shaping British policy. In London, the idea developed that China must be persuaded, if necessary by force, to accept diplomatic relations on terms more familiar to Western governments. Opening additional ports, establishing official representatives, and protecting British trade were all considered important goals. During the early months of 1840, the British government began preparing a military expedition to China. The task fell largely to the Royal Navy. Britain possessed one of the most powerful naval forces in the world at the time. Its ships had been designed for long voyages and could operate across the oceans with relative independence. In addition to naval vessels, the expedition would include soldiers drawn from Britain's expanding empire. Many of these troops came from British India. The East India Company already maintained large military forces there, and units from Bengal and Madras were assigned to support the campaign in China. These soldiers had experience serving in overseas operations and could be transported quickly by sea. The decision to send a military expedition did not mean that negotiations were abandoned entirely. British leaders hoped that the presence of a powerful fleet might persuade the Qing government to reach an agreement without prolonged conflict. If Chinese officials recognized the strength of the British Navy, they might accept new trade arrangements rather than risk war. Meanwhile, events continued to unfold along the southern coast of China. After the destruction of the opium cargo, British merchants had withdrawn many of their ships from Canton. The trading season that normally brought a steady flow of goods into the port had been disrupted. Some merchants moved their operations to nearby locations such as Macau, which was under Portuguese administration. Commissioner Lin Ziku remained determined to enforce the imperial prohibition on opium. He strengthened coastal patrols and ordered additional inspections of vessels suspected of smuggling. Reports sent to Beijing described the success of these measures and expressed confidence that the illegal trade had been effectively suppressed. Yet Lin also began to receive information about British naval preparations. Chinese officials stationed along the coast observed foreign warships moving through nearby waters. Although these ships did not immediately attack Chinese positions, their presence suggested that the situation might escalate. The Qing government now faced its own strategic choices. Some advisors believed that Britain might eventually accept the loss of the opium cargo and return to normal trade. Others warned that Western nations possessed powerful naval technology that China had rarely confronted before. Despite these warnings, many officials remained confident in China's ability to defend itself. The Qing Empire had governed vast territories for centuries. Its population and resources far exceeded those of most European nations. Many administrators assumed that foreign traders ultimately depended on Chinese markets and would hesitate to risk open conflict. This confidence was reinforced by earlier experiences with European traders. Foreign merchants had visited Chinese ports for generations without attempting large-scale military action. The imperial court, therefore, viewed the current dispute as another challenge that could likely be resolved through firmness and negotiation. But the balance of power in the 19th century was changing rapidly. Industrialization in Britain had produced new technologies that affected both commerce and warfare. Steam-powered ships were beginning to supplement traditional sailing vessels. Modern artillery allowed naval guns to fire more accurately and with greater destructive force. These developments gave the Royal Navy advantages that few Chinese officials fully understood. In the spring of 1840, British forces gathered in Asian waters. Ships assembled at strategic ports such as Singapore, where the expedition prepared to move north toward the Chinese coast. Naval officers reviewed maps of Chinese harbors and river systems while planning how best to apply pressure on the Qing government. The strategy developed by British planners focused on mobility. Instead of attempting to invade large inland regions, the Navy would target coastal ports and river entrances that were vital to Chinese commerce. By controlling these locations, Britain could disrupt trade and force negotiations without needing to occupy large territories. Meanwhile, the Qing court in Beijing continued receiving reports from Commissioner Lin. Lin described the successful suppression of the opium trade and recommended maintaining firm policies toward foreign merchants. He believed that if China remained resolute, the British would eventually accept Chinese law and resume legitimate commerce. Yet, other officials began expressing concern that the situation might soon move beyond trade disputes. Some coastal commanders warned that British ships possessed artillery capable of damaging Chinese defenses from distances that local cannons could not easily match. If fighting began at sea, they argued China might face difficulties responding effectively. Despite these warnings, the imperial court remained cautious. The Daoguang emperor hoped that diplomatic communication might still resolve the dispute. Envoys continued exchanging messages with British representatives, although progress remained limited. Throughout these months, the atmosphere along the Chinese coast grew increasingly tense. Merchant vessels waited uncertainly for the trading season to resume. Naval ships moved slowly through the surrounding waters, observing each other from a distance. Officials on both sides attempted to interpret the intentions of their counterparts. In many ways, the situation resembled a quiet pause before a larger storm. The destruction of the opium cargo had ended one stage of the crisis, but the underlying disagreements had not been resolved. Questions about trade rights, diplomatic equality, and legal authority remained unanswered. By the summer of 1840, the British Expeditionary Force was ready to begin its mission. Ships carrying sailors, soldiers, and artillery began moving toward the Chinese coastline. Their arrival would soon mark the beginning of a new phase in the dispute, one in which negotiations would be conducted, not only through letters and proclamations, but also through the movement of fleets and the sound of naval guns. By the time the British expedition finally moved toward the China coast in the summer of 1140, the dispute had changed in character. It was no longer simply a quarrel over confiscated cargo in Canton, nor only a disagreement about the treatment of merchants under Chinese law. British ministers had now decided that a naval and military demonstration would be used to force the Qing government into a new kind of negotiation. The immediate cause remained the destruction of the opium, but the stated goals were already broader. Britain wanted compensation, secure trade, official recognition for its representatives, and a wider opening of Chinese ports. The force assembled for this purpose reflected the scale of British power overseas. It was not an enormous army by European standards, and it was never intended to conquer the whole Qing Empire. That would have been unrealistic. China was too large, too populated, and too distant for a full invasion to be practical. Instead, British planners chose a different method. They would use naval mobility, disciplined infantry, and superior artillery to strike selected points along the coast. The idea was to pressure the Qing state where it was vulnerable, damage prestige, interrupt trade, and compel the court to talk on British terms. Much of the expedition drew on Britain's imperial system in Asia. Ships came from the Royal Navy stations in eastern waters, while troops were gathered from British India. Indian regiments, artillery units, marines, and naval crews formed a mixed force that could be deployed quickly by sea. This gave Britain a major advantage. It did not need to raise an army from scratch in Europe and send it halfway around the world. The empire already possessed men, ships, supplies, and bases across the Indian Ocean. Ports such as Singapore became useful staging points where ships could assemble, repair, and take on provisions before moving north. Even so, the expedition did not come together without difficulty. The climate, distances, and timing of monsoon winds affected movement. Some ships required repairs, Others had to wait for troops or supplies. Communication across imperial networks was never instantaneous, and commanders in Asia sometimes acted before receiving the latest political instructions from London. Yet, despite these practical problems, the British force that gathered by mid-1840 was formidable when compared with the local naval and coastal defenses that Qing officials could bring against it. The technological gap mattered. British warships carried heavier guns, were better drilled, and had crews accustomed to long-range naval operations. Some vessels used steam power, which was especially useful in coastal and riverine warfare. Steamers could move when the wind was weak or unfavorable, and they could maneuver in narrower channels with greater confidence than sailing ships alone against them. Many Qing naval vessels were still wooden war junks designed primarily for patrol, transport, and coastal defense. They were not useless, but they were badly matched against a navy shaped by decades of war, industry, and global deployment. British commanders also studied the geography of the Chinese coast carefully. They understood that it would not be enough simply to appear near Canton and make demands. Southern officials might delay, misunderstand, or pretend that the crisis remained local. To affect Qing decision-making at the highest level, pressure had to be felt beyond one province. That meant moving up the coast and demonstrating that British ships could threaten important ports, islands, and river mouths far from the Pearl River. In effect, the expedition would turn China's long coastline from a shield into a source of vulnerability. When the fleet reached Chinese waters, it did not begin with a massive assault. There was still an effort to combine pressure with diplomacy. British representatives wanted the Qing court to receive their demands, and they hoped that a display of force might achieve concessions without an extended campaign. Yet, the very movement of armed ships along the coast already altered the balance. Local officials, once confident that foreigners could be confined to regulated trade zones, now had to confront the reality that these same foreigners could choose where to appear and where to strike. The first British objectives reflected this logic. Instead of throwing everything immediately at Canton, the expedition moved towards strategic points that could weaken the Qing position and increase British leverage. One key early target was the Jiaoshan Archipelago, a group of islands off the eastern coast near the approaches to the Yangtze region. Zhuan offered a useful harbor and a position from which British forces could threaten major commercial routes. Its capture would also send a message to the Qing court that the war, if it became a war, would not remain confined to the south. For Qing officials, this was unsettling. The old assumption that foreign trouble could be contained in Canton was becoming harder to maintain. Reports now describe British movement along multiple sections of the coast. This did not yet mean panic in Beijing, but it did create uncertainty. The Dao Guang Emperor and his ministers had to determine whether the British intended a punitive expedition, a temporary blockade, or something larger. The court still hoped that firmness might succeed. Yet, it was becoming more difficult to ignore the military imbalance that coastal commanders were beginning to describe. Within the Qing system, there was another problem. Information moved through memorials, provincial reports, and bureaucratic summaries. That system could be very effective in ordinary times, but in a fast-moving coastal conflict, it had weaknesses. Delays were common. Officials sometimes softened bad news before passing it upward. Others exaggerated their own success to avoid blame. As a result, the court did not always receive a perfectly clear picture of the military situation. This would become one of the recurring features of the war. British commanders made decisions with maps, reconnaissance, and naval intelligence, while the Qing court often depended on filtered reports that mixed fact, caution, and self-protection. British policy also remained mixed in motive. Some men involved in the expedition were driven mainly by commercial concerns. Others believed they were defending national honor after what they considered an insult to British authority. Still others cared most about opening China to a more formal diplomatic relationship. The opium question remained present, but the conflict was increasingly being framed in Britain as something wider than narcotics. Ministers spoke about security for trade, protection for subjects, and fair treatment for British representatives. This language made it easier to defend military action to critics at home, even though the origins of the crisis were impossible to separate from the opium traffic. The arrival of the expedition therefore marked a major turning point. Up to this stage, the Qing government had been dealing with merchants, smugglers, and consular officials. Now it faced an organized imperial force with naval support, clear instructions, and a strategy built on selective coercion. The British did not need immediate conquest to succeed. They only needed to show repeatedly and convincingly that Chinese coastal defenses could not stop them from taking positions that mattered. As more ships gathered, the fleet's very presence affected local commerce. Merchants hesitated. Coastal communities watched the sea lanes nervously. Rumors spread faster than reliable information. Some believed the British intended to attack Canton at once. Others thought they would sail directly north and threaten the approaches to the capital. This uncertainty served British purposes. It stretched attention across a wide area and made it harder for the court to concentrate forces confidently at a single point. The expedition also revealed the administrative confidence of the British Empire. In this period, orders moved from London to India and onward to East Asian stations. Resources were drawn from colonies that had become linked by regular sea routes and military bureaucracy. The campaign in China was therefore not just a British national effort in a narrow sense. It was an imperial operation in which revenue from India, manpower from colonial armies, and naval strength from global stations all worked together. The Qing Empire was not facing a single squadron acting on its own initiative. It was confronting a system that could project organized force over very long distances. Yet, for all their advantages, British commanders still had to proceed carefully. Climate, disease, and supply could damage an expedition as surely as enemy fire. Troops transported long distances by sea were vulnerable to illness. Ships needed fresh water, food, and repair. Harbors had to be secured before operations could continue inland along rivers or coasts. Britain's military edge was real, but it was not magical. Success required planning, discipline, and the steady use of maritime power. There was also the question of politics after victory. British commanders knew that seizing a port or defeating a coastal defense was only useful if it produced concessions. A campaign of random destruction would impress no one for long and might even harden resistance. So from the beginning, force and diplomacy were meant to work together. Every movement of the fleet carried an argument within it. The guns announced capability, but the letters that followed demanded specific results: compensation, access, recognition, and an end to the old trade restrictions. By the end of this opening phase, one fact had become unmistakable. The dispute over opium had entered the world of strategy. Gunboats, transports, marines, Indian infantry, and diplomatic letters were now part of the same story. The Qing Empire, which had sought to crush an illegal trade in one coastal province, was confronting a global naval power determined to convert a commercial grievance into political advantage. The war had not yet reached its most dramatic battles, but the machinery that would produce them was now in motion. By the middle of 1840, the British expedition had begun operating along the Chinese coast. The fleet that arrived was not overwhelming in size when compared to the immense population and territory of the Qing Empire, but it possessed important advantages in organization, discipline, and technology. British planners understood that they did not need to conquer large regions of China in order to influence QQ policy. Instead, they intended to strike carefully chosen points along the coast and along major waterways, creating pressure that would eventually force negotiations. The first phase of the war therefore unfolded largely at sea. British naval commanders studied the Chinese coastline and selected strategic positions where a relatively small force could create significant disruption. Ports, islands, and river entrances were particularly valuable targets. By controlling these locations, the British could interrupt regional trade, threaten larger cities inland, and demonstrate the weakness of Qing coastal defenses. One of the earliest objectives was the Jiaoshan archipelago. Johann lay off the eastern coast of China near the approaches to the Yangtze River. The islands offered a natural harbor and a location from which naval forces could monitor shipping in the surrounding waters. British officers believed that capturing the islands would provide a secure base of operations while also sending a clear signal to the Qing government that the war could extend far beyond Canton. In July 1840, the British fleet approached Zhoushan. The Chinese garrison stationed there consisted primarily of local troops and naval units accustomed to patrolling coastal waters rather than confronting a modern European navy. When British ships appeared offshore and began preparing for action, Qing defenders attempted to organize their resistance. Cannons positioned along the shoreline and fired toward the approaching vessels, but the range and accuracy of these weapons were limited. British ships responded with heavier artillery. The naval guns mounted on the British vessels could strike targets along the coast with greater force and distance than most Chinese cannons. Under sustained bombardment, the local defenses struggled to maintain their positions. British Marines and soldiers soon landed on the island and moved inland toward the main town of Dingai. The capture of Dingai followed relatively quickly. Chinese defenders fought in several locations around the town, but they lacked the coordination and equipment necessary to repel the landing force. Once British troops secured the harbor and surrounding positions, the island effectively fell under their control. For the British expedition, the capture of Zhoushan served several purposes. First, it provided a safe anchorage where ships could repair damage, take on fresh supplies, and organize further operations. Second, it demonstrated to Qing officials that British forces could strike far from Canton and still succeed. Third, it offered a clear example of the difference between British naval artillery and the coastal defenses maintained by the Qing Empire. News of the island's capture soon reached Beijing. Within the imperial court, reactions were mixed. Some officials believed that the loss of a distant island did not represent a serious threat to the empire as a whole. China possessed a vast territory and minor coastal setbacks had occurred in earlier centuries without lasting consequences. Other advisors, however, warned that the event revealed a dangerous vulnerability. If British ships could capture strategic islands and ports at will, they might gradually extend their reach along the coast and threaten important commercial regions. The Yangtze River Basin, in particular, represented one of the wealthiest areas of the empire. Any disruption to trade there could create serious economic difficulties. Despite these concerns, the Qing government initially hoped that the conflict might still be contained. Officials in Canton continued corresponding with British representatives, while the imperial court attempted to understand the intentions behind the expedition. The Daoguang Emperor expected his administrators to maintain order and protect Chinese territory, but he also hoped that negotiations might eventually restore peace. Meanwhile, conditions on Xi'an revealed another challenge facing the British expedition. Although the island offered a valuable base, the climate and environment proved difficult for soldiers stationed there. Many troops had traveled long distances from India or other regions of the empire. The unfamiliar weather combined with limited medical knowledge at the time created opportunities for disease to spread. Illness soon affected a significant portion of the garrison. Fever and other infections weakened the soldiers who remained on the island, reducing the number of men available for further operations. British commanders realized that holding the position permanently might prove costly if disease continued to spread among their troops. As a result, the British eventually withdrew some forces from Johan and repositioned their fleet. The campaign did not end with this adjustment. Instead, British planners began shifting their attention toward other coastal targets that might increase pressure on the Qing government. At the same time, diplomatic communication continued between the two sides. British representatives hoped that the demonstration of naval power might persuade the Qing court to negotiate. Their demands included compensation for the destroyed opium, secure trading rights for British merchants, and the establishment of clearer diplomatic relations between the two governments. From the Qing perspective, accepting such demands would have represented a serious departure from traditional policy. For centuries, the Chinese Empire had treated foreign traders as visitors who operated within Chinese territory, under Chinese authority. Granting equal diplomatic status to foreign representatives would have required significant changes in how the Qing state viewed its relationship with the outside world. These questions made negotiations extremely difficult. While diplomats exchanged letters and proposals, British ships continued moving along the Chinese coastline. Each new appearance of the fleet reminded local officials that the conflict had not been resolved. Several smaller naval encounters occurred during this period. Chinese war junks attempted to challenge British vessels in coastal waters, but these engagements rarely produced favorable results for the Qing Navy. The British ships carried more powerful guns and were supported by crews trained in coordinated naval tactics. Even when Chinese defenders fought with determination, their vessels were often outmatched. These early clashes confirmed what some Qing officials had already begun to suspect. The technological and organizational gap between the two navies was wider than many had previously believed. While China possessed numerous ships, many of them were designed for river patrol or coastal transport, rather than large-scale naval warfare. British commanders recognized this advantage and used it carefully. Instead of risking unnecessary losses in large battles, they continued focusing on strategic positions that would influence the broader conflict. Controlling coastal waters allowed them to choose when and where to strike next. For civilians living along the coast, the presence of foreign warships created uncertainty. Fishing communities and small port towns watched the movements of the fleet with growing concern. Rumors spread quickly about possible attacks or blockades. Merchants worried about the safety of their cargoes, and local officials struggled to maintain order while awaiting instructions from higher authorities. As the months passed, it became clear that the dispute between Britain and China was not going to disappear quickly. The capture of Jawan had shown that the British expedition could achieve its objectives with relatively small forces. At the same time, the Qing Empire had not yet found an effective strategy for resisting these operations. Both sides now faced a longer struggle than they had initially expected. British commanders prepared new plans for advancing along the Chinese coast. Qing officials gathered additional troops and attempted to strengthen key defensive positions. The conflict was gradually expanding, moving beyond the initial dispute over opium into a broader contest over trade, diplomacy, and power. The next phase of the war would bring the British fleet back toward the southern ports where the crisis had begun. And as the ships moved again toward the Pearl River, the city of Canton would soon find itself once more at the center of events. As the conflict entered 1841, the struggle between the Qing Empire and Britain moved toward one of the most important regions in southern China, the Pearl River Delta. This vast network of waterways, towns, and trading centers had long served as the gateway through which foreign merchants conducted commerce with the Qing Dynasty. Canton stood at the center of this system, and nearby coastal defenses guarded the river approaches that led toward the city. For British commanders, the Pearl River was a critical objective. If they could control the entrances to the river, they would gain direct influence over the most important trading center in southern China. At the same time, striking these defenses would demonstrate to the Qing government that the British Navy could penetrate even the most heavily guarded parts of the coast. The key positions protecting the river lay near a place known as the Bogue. The Bogue was a narrow passage between steep hills where the Pearl River opened toward the sea. Fortifications had been constructed there to defend the approaches to Canton. Chinese artillery batteries lined the shoreline, and defensive chains stretched across parts of the river to slow the passage of enemy vessels. For centuries, these defenses had served their purpose well. Most foreign ships entering the region had done so peacefully, and the forts provided a visible reminder of Qing authority over the harbor. But they had rarely faced an opponent equipped with the kind of naval power Britain now possessed. Early in 1841, British ships moved toward the Bogue forts. The fleet included warships armed with powerful cannons, as well as smaller vessels capable of navigating the narrower parts of the river. British commanders carefully observed the positions of the Chinese defenses before launching their attack. When the bombardment began, the difference in artillery quickly became apparent. British naval guns fired with greater accuracy and range than many of the cannons mounted in the Chinese forts. Explosions shook the defensive positions as British shells struck walls and gun emplacements. Chinese gunners returned fire, but their shots often fell short or struck ships that were heavily built to withstand such attacks. Once the bombardment had weakened the defenses, British Marines and soldiers moved toward the shore. Landing parties advanced against the forts, while naval guns continued to provide support from the river. Chinese defenders resisted bravely in several locations, but they faced an opponent with superior firepower and coordinated tactics. Within a relatively short time, several of the key forts at the Bogue fell under British control. The capture of these defenses opened the river approaches to the British fleet. Ships could now move further inland toward Canton, bringing the war directly into the region where the opium dispute had first erupted. For Qing officials in the south, the loss of the Bogue forts was deeply troubling. These fortifications had been considered a strong barrier protecting the city of Canton. Their fall suggested that the British Navy possessed a level of military capability that the Qing defenses had not been designed to confront. News of the defeat quickly reached the imperial court in Beijing. The Daoguang Emperor expressed anger at the reports, questioning how such important defenses had been lost. Officials responsible for the region faced criticism, and some were removed from their positions as the court searched for explanations. At the same time, the Qing government began reconsidering its strategy. Some advisors argued that continuing the war without negotiation might lead to further losses along the coast. Others insisted that the empire must resist foreign pressure in order to preserve its authority and reputation. Meanwhile, British commanders believed that the fall of the Bogue forts had placed them in a strong position. With the river approaches open, they could threaten Canton directly. British forces advanced further along the Pearl River, capturing additional defensive positions and establishing control over key points along the waterway. The situation created growing tension within the city. Canton was one of the largest and busiest commercial centers in southern China. Merchants, artisans, laborers, and officials filled its streets. Many residents had little direct involvement in the political conflict between Britain and the Qing government. Yet the war was now approaching their city. Local authorities attempted to maintain order while preparing for the possibility of further attacks. Militia units were organized and defensive measures were strengthened within the city. At the same time, some merchants worried about the impact the fighting might have on trade and commerce. British representatives also began discussing the possibility of negotiations. Their objectives remained consistent: compensation for the destroyed opium, secure trading rights, and clearer diplomatic relations with the Qing government. With the British fleet now positioned near Canton, they believed the Qing court might be more willing to consider these demands. In early 1841, discussions between the two sides produced a tentative agreement known as the Convention of Twenepi. Under this arrangement, Chinese officials would provide compensation to British merchants and open the possibility of further negotiations. The agreement also included a proposal to transfer control of Hong Kong Island to Britain as a base for trade. However, the agreement soon became controversial. When news of the convention reached Beijing, the Daoguang Emperor rejected it. He believed that the concessions granted to Britain were too great, and that the officials who had negotiated the agreement had exceeded their authority. As a result, the conflict resumed. The breakdown of the agreement demonstrated how difficult it had become for the Qing government to balance diplomacy and resistance. Some officials feared that further concessions would weaken the empire's authority. Others believed that refusing negotiations might only prolong a war that China was struggling to win. British forces, for their part, continued pressing their advantage. The fleet maintained its presence along the Pearl River, while additional operations were planned elsewhere along the coast. The capture of strategic points had already demonstrated the mobility and strength of British naval power. For the people living in southern China, the war was now an unavoidable reality. Ships carrying foreign soldiers and artillery moved through waters that had once been used mainly for trade. Defensive walls and forts that had stood for decades were damaged or destroyed. Communities that had rarely encountered foreign armies now watched the conflict unfold around them. The war that had begun with disputes over opium cargo had expanded into a broader confrontation between two very different political and economic systems. As 1841 continued, both sides prepared for further battles and negotiations. The Qing government still hoped to defend its authority, while Britain sought to reshape the rules governing trade and diplomacy with China. By the middle of 1841, the conflict had clearly entered a new phase. What had begun as a limited dispute around Canton had now become a broader coastal war. British forces had demonstrated that they could defeat defensive positions along the Pearl River and operate freely along large sections of China's coastline. Yet, the campaign was far from finished. British leaders understood that controlling one region alone would not be enough to force the Qing government into a lasting agreement. Instead, the strategy evolved toward expanding pressure across multiple parts of the coast. The British fleet began moving northward again, targeting important ports and strategic locations that supported China's internal trade networks. By capturing these areas, British commanders hoped to demonstrate that the Qing government could not protect its most important commercial routes. One of the next major targets was the port of Amoy, known today as Xiamen. Amoy lay along the southeastern coast of China in Fujian province. The city had long served as an important trading center, linking inland markets with maritime commerce. Its harbor allowed ships to anchor safely, and its position made it a convenient gateway for goods traveling between southern China and other regions of Asia. For British planners, capturing Amoy would serve several purposes. First, it would disrupt coastal trade routes that supported the regional economy. Second, it would demonstrate that the war had expanded beyond the Pearl River Delta. Finally, it would create another base where British ships could anchor and resupply. In August 1841, the British fleet approached Amoy. Chinese forces had fortified several positions around the harbor, including artillery batteries and defensive walls designed to protect the port from attack. When British ships appeared offshore, Qing troops prepared to resist. The battle began with a naval bombardment. British warships opened fire on the coastal fortifications while maneuvering into positions that allowed them to strike key defensive points. The heavy naval guns gradually damaged the walls and artillery emplacements that protected the harbor. Chinese defenders responded with determination. Artillery crews fired back at the attacking ships and soldiers prepared for the possibility of a landing. Despite their efforts, the British fleet maintained the advantage in both range and firepower. Once the bombardment weakened the defenses, British troops moved ashore. Marines and infantry units advanced toward the fortifications while naval guns continued firing from the harbor. Fighting occurred at several defensive positions, but the Qing troops struggled to coordinate their resistance against the combined naval and land assault. Within a short period, the main defensive positions around Amoy fell. British troops entered the city and secured the port. The capture of Amoy marked another clear demonstration of British mobility and military organization. A relatively small force had defeated the local defenses of an important coastal city. News of the loss spread quickly. Reports traveled along coastal trade routes and eventually reached the imperial court in Beijing. For Qing officials, the fall of another major port confirmed that the conflict was no longer limited to one region. At the same time, British forces continued expanding their operations. After securing Amoy, the fleet moved north again toward the port of Ningbo. This city lay further along the eastern coast, near the mouth of the Yong River. Like Amoy, Ningbo had long been a center of regional trade and communication. The capture of Ningbo followed a pattern similar to earlier operations. British ships approached the harbor and began bombarding defensive positions. Chinese troops attempted to defend the city, but once again, the difference in naval artillery and coordination played a decisive role. British landing forces quickly gained control of key points within the harbor and surrounding areas. When Ningbo fell under British control in October 1841, the campaign had expanded significantly. The British fleet now operated from multiple ports along the coast, creating a chain of positions that allowed ships to move freely between them. These successes strengthened Britain's bargaining position. Each captured port represented both a military victory and a political message. The Qing government could see that British forces were capable of striking different regions of the empire, without facing strong resistance. For the Qing court, the situation was becoming increasingly difficult. The empire still possessed vast resources and millions of soldiers, but coordinating those forces against a mobile naval opponent proved challenging. Many Qing troops were trained primarily for land warfare or internal security rather than coastal defense against modern warships. Local officials also faced logistical difficulties. Moving large armies across the empire required time and organization. Meanwhile, British ships could sail quickly between ports, choosing where and when to attack. Despite these challenges, the Qing government did not surrender immediately. Additional troops were sent toward threatened regions, and efforts were made to strengthen defensive positions. Officials hoped that by reinforcing key cities, they might slow the British advance. In Ningbo, Chinese forces attempted to reorganize after the city's capture. Local residents watched as foreign troops occupied parts of their port. Markets and warehouses that had once handled domestic trade now stood under the control of British soldiers and sailors. For civilians living in these regions, the war created a sense of uncertainty. Some merchants worried about the safety of their goods. Others hoped that the presence of foreign forces might eventually restore stable trade conditions. The situation varied from town to town, but across the eastern coast, people were becoming increasingly aware that the conflict with Britain was reshaping their local economies. Meanwhile, British commanders continued planning the next stage of the campaign. Their strategy focused on applying pressure where it would have the greatest impact on Qing decision-making. The ultimate goal was not simply to capture ports, but to convince the imperial court that continuing the war would bring further losses. One region held particular importance in this strategy. The Yangtze River system connected some of the most prosperous areas of China, including major cities such as Nanjing. If British forces could move toward this region, they might threaten the economic heart of the empire. The idea of a British fleet advancing into the Yangtze Basin began to worry Qing officials. Such a move could disrupt grain shipments, trade routes, and communications between northern and southern provinces. The possibility added new urgency to discussions within the imperial court. By the end of 1841, the pattern of the war had become clear. British naval mobility allowed their forces to capture strategic coastal cities. Relative speed, Qing defenders fought bravely in many engagements, but their weapons and tactics often proved less effective against modern warships and coordinated landing forces. With ports such as Amoy Ningbo under British control, the pressure on the Qing government continued to grow. The conflict that had begun as a dispute over trade had now expanded into a series of military campaigns stretching across hundreds of miles of coastline. And as British commanders began considering operations further inland along China's great rivers, the war was moving toward a decisive stage that would eventually force the Qing Empire to reconsider its position. By the beginning of 1842, the conflict between Britain and the Qing Empire had entered its most decisive phase. The war had already stretched across several major ports along the Chinese coastline. British forces had captured cities such as Amoy and Ningbo, and their ships now operated with increasing freedom in waters that had once been firmly under Qing control. Yet, despite these losses, the Qing government had not agreed to Britain's demands. Officials in Beijing still hoped that resistance might slow the foreign advance or persuade the British to accept a compromise that preserved imperial authority. But British commanders had already begun planning the next stage of the campaign, and this phase would bring the war into one of the most important economic regions of China. The focus now turned toward the Yangtze River. The Yangtze was one of the longest rivers in the world and served as a central artery of Chinese commerce. Goods from inland provinces traveled along its waters toward coastal ports, while grain shipments moved northward to supply major cities. Controlling access to the river meant influencing a large portion of the empire's economic activity. British planners recognized this importance. If their fleet could move into the Yangtze region, they would gain leverage far greater than that provided by coastal victories alone. Threatening the river would place pressure on some of the most prosperous provinces in the Qing Empire. Before advancing toward the Yangtze itself, British forces targeted several key positions along the eastern coast that guarded the river's approaches. One of these objectives was the city of Ningbo, which had already fallen under British control in late 1841. Qing commanders hoped to reclaim the city and restore their defensive line along the coast. In early 1842, Chinese troops launched an attempt to retake Ningbo. The attack took place during the night when Qing soldiers moved toward the British-held positions surrounding the city. Their plan relied on surprise and numerical advantage. If they could overwhelm the smaller British garrison quickly, they might regain control before reinforcements arrived. The battle that followed demonstrated once again the challenges facing Qing forces. Although Chinese soldiers advanced with determination, the British defenders possessed well-organized defensive positions and modern firearms. Muskets and artillery fired from fortified points along the city's perimeter, forcing the attacking troops to fight under heavy fire. After several hours of intense fighting, the Qing assault failed. British forces maintained control of Ningbo, and the attempt to retake the city ended, with significant losses for the attacking troops. The outcome reinforced the growing realization among Qing commanders that defeating the British through direct assaults would be extremely difficult. Meanwhile, British leaders were preparing for a broader advance. The fleet began moving northward toward the mouth of the Yangtze River. This movement signaled a clear shift in strategy. Instead of concentrating on isolated coastal cities, the British expedition now aimed at the economic heart of the Qing Empire. The next major objective became the city of Zhenzang. Zhenzang stood at a strategic point where the Yangtze River intersected with the Grand Canal. This location made it one of the most important transportation hubs in eastern China. Grain shipments from the south passed through the canal toward northern provinces, including the capital region around Beijing. If Zhenjiang fell, the flow of grain and goods along these routes could be severely disrupted. In the summer of 1842 British ships approached the Yangtze and began advancing along the river. For many Chinese officials, this development was alarming. The Yangtze had rarely faced attacks from foreign naval forces, and the presence of British warships moving inland created uncertainty about how best to respond. Defensive positions were established along the riverbanks, and Qing troops prepared to resist the advancing fleet. When British forces reached Zhenjiang in July 1842, they encountered determined resistance from the city's defenders. Unlike some earlier engagements, the battle for Zhenjiang involved significant fighting within the city itself. British ships began the attack by bombarding the defensive walls and artillery positions along the riverfront. Naval guns struck the fortifications while landing parties prepared to move ashore. Once the bombardment weakened key positions, British troops advanced into the city. The fighting that followed was intense. Chinese soldiers and local defenders resisted the advance through the streets and defensive structures inside Zhenjiang. Despite their determination, they faced opponents with better coordinated tactics and heavier weapons. After a day of fierce combat, British forces secured control of the city. The capture of Zhenjiang had major consequences for the Qing government. With the city under British control, the junction between the Yangtze River and the Grand Canal was effectively blocked. This interruption threatened the flow of grain shipments that supplied northern provinces, including the region surrounding Beijing. The economic and logistical pressure on the Qing court increased dramatically. Officials in the capital realized that continued fighting might place vital supply routes at risk. The possibility that British forces could advance further inland added to the urgency of the situation. For the first time since the conflict began, serious negotiations became unavoidable. The Daoguang Emperor authorized officials to begin discussions aimed at ending the war. Representatives from both sides prepared to meet along the Yangtze River where the British fleet remained positioned near key strategic points. These negotiations eventually took place aboard British warships anchored near the city of Nanjing. The location itself carried symbolic importance. Nanjing was one of the most historically significant cities in China, and the presence of a foreign fleet nearby demonstrated how far the conflict had progressed. British representatives arrived with clear demands. They sought compensation for the destroyed opium cargo, the opening of several Chinese ports to foreign trade, and the establishment of formal diplomatic relations between the two nations. Another important demand involved the transfer of Hong Kong Island to British control, where it could serve as a permanent base for commerce. Qing officials approached the negotiations with caution. They hoped to bring the war to an end while preserving as much imperial authority as possible. However, the recent military defeats and the strategic situation along the Yangtze left them with limited bargaining power. The result of these negotiations would soon become one of the most important agreements in 19th-century Asian history. The treaty signed in Nanjing would mark the formal conclusion of the conflict and establish new rules governing trade and diplomacy between China and Britain. For the Qing Empire, the agreement represented a turning point. The war had revealed weaknesses in coastal defenses and exposed the challenges of confronting industrialized naval powers. For Britain, the treaty promised expanded trade opportunities and a permanent foothold along the Chinese coast. The conflict that had begun with disputes over opium had now reshaped the relationship between the two empires. And as negotiations reached their final stage along the Yangtze River, the outcome would soon influence the future of China's interactions with the. In the late summer of 1842, the long and difficult conflict between Britain and the Qing Empire approached its final stage. British forces had moved steadily along the Chinese coast and had now reached the Yangtze River basin, one of the most important economic regions in the empire. The capture of Zhenjiang had blocked the connection between the Yangtze and the Grand Canal, threatening the flow of grain shipments that supported northern provinces and the capital itself. This strategic situation forced the Qing government to confront a difficult reality. For more than 2 years, the empire had attempted to resist the British expedition through coastal defenses and military operations. Yet, the British fleet had continued advancing, capturing key ports and demonstrating its ability to move freely along China's rivers and coastline. Now, the war had reached a point where continued fighting might create even greater disruption. Grain transported along the Grand Canal was essential for feeding large populations in northern China. If those shipments were interrupted for long periods, shortages and unrest could follow. Qing officials understood that protecting this supply network was one of their most important responsibilities. As a result, the imperial court authorized serious negotiations with the British. These negotiations took place near the city of Nanjing, where British ships had anchored along the Yangtze River. The presence of the fleet so close to such an important city illustrated how far the conflict had progressed since the early disputes in Canton. British representatives arrived at the negotiations with clear objectives. Their government expected compensation for the opium that had been destroyed in 1839. In addition, Britain sought broader changes to the trade system that had previously restricted foreign merchants to the single port of Canton. British officials believed that opening several additional ports would create a more stable and profitable commercial relationship. Another important demand involved diplomatic recognition. British representatives wanted formal relations between the two governments based on the idea that both nations were sovereign states interacting as equals. This concept differed significantly from the traditional Qing view of foreign trade, in which outside merchants were treated as visitors operating under Chinese authority. For Qing officials participating in the negotiations, these demands were difficult to accept. The empire had long viewed itself as the central power within its regional system. Granting foreign nations equal diplomatic status required adjusting traditions that had guided imperial policy for centuries. Yet the military situation left little room for refusal. British forces controlled several important coastal cities, and their fleet remained positioned along the Yangtze River. Continuing the war risked further losses and disruption to the empire's internal trade networks. After several days of discussion, both sides reached an agreement. On the 29th of August 1842, representatives of Britain and the Qing Empire signed what became known as the Treaty of Nanking. The document formally ended the First Opium War and established new rules governing relations between the two countries. The treaty included several key provisions. First, China agreed to pay a large indemnity to Britain. This payment covered compensation for the destroyed opium cargo, as well as debts owed by Chinese merchants to British traders. The indemnity was to be paid in installments over several years. Second, the treaty opened 5 Chinese ports to foreign trade. In addition to Canton, the ports of Xi'an, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai were designated as treaty ports where British merchants could live and conduct business. These ports would gradually become important centers of international commerce. Third, the treaty required China to cede Hong Kong Island to Britain. The island would serve as a permanent base where British merchants could operate under British administration. Over time, Hong Kong would develop into one of the most important trading ports in Asia. Finally, the treaty established a framework for future diplomatic communication between the two governments. Although it did not fully resolve every legal question between Chinese authorities and foreign citizens, it marked the beginning of a new relationship that differed from the earlier Canton system. For Britain, the treaty represented a major success. The government had achieved its goals of securing compensation, expanding trade opportunities, and obtaining a permanent foothold along the Chinese coast. British merchants soon began establishing new trading operations in the ports opened by the agreement. For the Qing Empire, however, the treaty carried more complicated consequences. Although the war had ended, the agreement forced China to accept terms that many officials regarded as unfavorable. The loss of Hong Kong and the opening of multiple ports to foreign merchants marked a significant shift in how the empire interacted with outside powers. Within China, reactions to the treaty varied. Some officials believed that ending the war quickly had been necessary to prevent further damage to the economy. Others viewed the agreement as a troubling sign that the empire's traditional defenses were no longer sufficient against modern industrial powers. At the same time, the treaty did not address every issue that had contributed to the conflict. Questions about tariffs, legal jurisdiction over foreign citizens, and the opium trade itself remained only partially resolved. These unresolved problems would eventually lead to further tensions between China and Western powers in the decades that followed. In the months after the treaty was signed, British forces gradually withdrew from many of the positions they had occupied during the war. Ships returned to their bases and soldiers stationed in captured cities departed as the agreement came into effect. Trade soon began expanding in the newly opened ports, where merchants from several nations established commercial communities. Shanghai, in particular, would become one of the most important international trading centers in East Asia. Foreign merchants built warehouses and offices along the city's waterfront. Ships carrying goods from Europe, India, and Southeast Asia began arriving regularly. Over time, the port developed into a major hub connecting Chinese markets with global trade networks. For the Qing government, the end of the war offered an opportunity to reconsider the empire's approach to foreign relations. Some officials began studying Western technology and military methods more carefully. Others focused on strengthening coastal defenses in case similar conflicts occurred in the future. Yet, despite these efforts, the Treaty of Nanking marked the beginning of a new era. China's relationship with foreign powers would now be shaped by treaties and trade, agreements that opened parts of the country to international influence. The war had demonstrated that technological and military developments in Europe had altered the balance of power along the Asian coast. For ordinary people living in the treaty ports, these changes became visible in everyday life. Foreign ships filled the harbors. Merchants from different nations established businesses, and new cultural exchanges gradually appeared in the cities where international trade expanded. The First Opium War had begun as a dispute over a single commodity. By the time it ended, it had reshaped the political and economic relationship between China and the Western world. The treaty signed along the Yangtze River in 1842 closed one chapter of the conflict, but it also opened a new period in Chinese history that would bring further challenges in the years ahead. Although the Treaty of Nanking ended the fighting between Britain and the Qing Empire in 1842, the consequences of the war continued unfolding across China in the years that followed. The agreement had brought peace, but it also introduced new arrangements that reshaped trade, diplomacy, and daily life in several coastal regions. The 5 treaty ports opened by the agreement soon became centers of intense commercial activity. Canton, which had previously served as the single gateway for foreign trade, was now joined by 4 additional ports: Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai. Each of these locations gradually developed foreign merchant communities, where traders from Britain and other countries established offices, warehouses, and residences. Among these cities, Shanghai quickly grew into one of the most important. Located near the mouth of the Yangtze River, Shanghai had natural advantages as a commercial hub. Goods produced in the vast agricultural and industrial regions along the Yangtze Basin could be transported easily to the city by river and canal. From there, ships carried those goods to markets across Asia and beyond. Foreign merchants recognized the city's potential almost immediately. British trading companies began building facilities along the waterfront, creating districts where international commerce flourished. Warehouses stored tea, silk, cotton, and other products waiting to be loaded onto ships bound for distant ports. Over time, other nations also established commercial communities in Shanghai. Merchants from the United States, France, and several European countries opened businesses there, turning the city into an international trading center. These foreign settlements often operated under their own administrative arrangements, creating districts where Western laws and customs were applied alongside Chinese authority. This arrangement reflected another important development that followed the Treaty of Nanking. Foreign citizens living in the treaty ports gradually gained a form of legal protection known as extraterritoriality. Under this principle, foreigners accused of crimes in China could be tried in courts operated by their own governments rather than by Chinese courts. For Western nations, extraterritoriality provided reassurance that their citizens would be treated according to familiar legal systems. For Qing officials, however, the arrangement represented a significant limitation on imperial authority within certain parts of their own territory. The existence of foreign courts and administrative systems inside treaty ports highlighted the growing influence of outside powers along the Chinese coast. Meanwhile, Hong Kong began developing as Britain's permanent base in the region. When the island had been ceded under the treaty, it was a relatively small settlement with a modest population. Yet its location near the entrance to the Pearl River made it an ideal harbor for ships engaged in trade with southern China. British administrators soon began transforming the island into a major port. Docks, warehouses, and administrative buildings appeared along the shoreline. Merchants established offices where they could manage trade with the mainland. Ships traveling between Europe, India, and China used Hong Kong as a convenient stopping point where supplies could be replenished. Within a few years, the island had grown into a busy center of maritime commerce. The expansion of trade created opportunities for merchants, sailors, laborers, and craftsmen who moved to the island seeking work. Hong Kong gradually became one of the most active ports in East Asia. Despite these developments, the Treaty of Nanking did not resolve all the tensions that had led to the war. One important issue remained largely unrest: the opium trade itself. Although the war had begun because of disputes surrounding opium, the treaty did not officially legalize or prohibit the drug. As a result, opium continued entering China through commercial networks that operated in and around the treaty ports. Over time, the volume of opium imported into China actually increased. The expansion of international trade made it easier for merchants to transport goods between ports, and the demand for opium within China remained strong. This development worried Manching officials who believed the drug continued harming Chinese society. The Qing government also faced internal challenges during the years following the war. Population growth, economic pressures, and regional tensions created difficulties for local administrators across the empire. In several regions, social unrest began appearing as communities struggled with poverty and political dissatisfaction. Although these problems had multiple causes, the war with Britain had revealed weaknesses in China's military defenses and administrative systems. Some officials began calling for reforms aimed at strengthening the empire. These discussions focused on improving coastal defenses, modernizing certain military technologies, and studying Western industrial methods. The idea that China needed to learn from foreign nations in order to protect its sovereignty gradually gained support among some members of the government. Yet reforms within such a large empire were slow and complicated. Traditional institutions had governed the Qing state for centuries, and many officials remained cautious about adopting foreign methods too quickly. Balancing reform with stability became an ongoing challenge. Meanwhile, foreign powers continued expanding their presence in East Asia. The commercial opportunities created by the treaty ports attracted merchants from multiple nations. Britain remained the most influential Western power in China at the time, but other countries soon negotiated their own agreements with the Qing government. These additional treaties granted many of the same trading privileges that Britain had secured. As a result, the network of international commerce along China's coast expanded rapidly during the mid-9th century. Ports that had once hosted only occasional foreign traders now welcomed ships from across the world. For ordinary residents living in the treaty ports, daily life began to change. Markets offered new goods imported from overseas. Foreign buildings and ships became familiar sights along the waterfront. Cultural exchanges gradually introduced new ideas, technologies, and customs into the port cities. At the same time, the presence of foreign communities sometimes created tensions. Chinese residents and foreign merchants did not always share the same expectations about law, trade, and social behavior. Disagreements occasionally occurred, especially when legal questions involved both Chinese citizens and foreign residents. These complexities meant that the peace established by the Treaty of Nanking remained fragile. Although the First Opium War had ended, the issues surrounding trade, diplomacy, and legal authority continued shaping relations between China and Western nations. In the years ahead, further disputes would arise as both sides attempted to interpret and enforce the agreements that had been signed in 1842. The war had marked the beginning of a new era in China's interactions with the outside world. Foreign merchants, diplomats, and ships were now permanent features of several Chinese ports. International trade expanded quickly, bringing both economic opportunity and new challenges for the Qing Empire. In the years following the Treaty of Nanking, the relationship between China and the Western powers entered a new and uncertain stage. The war had ended and trade was expanding again through the newly opened treaty ports. Yet beneath this surface of renewed commerce, many of the tensions that had contributed to the conflict remained unresolved. For the Qing government, the outcome of the war raised difficult questions. The empire had governed vast territories for centuries and had maintained stability through a well-established administrative system. Yet, the conflict with Britain had revealed that traditional coastal defenses and diplomatic practices were no longer sufficient when confronting industrialized naval powers. Some officials within the Qing court began discussing the need for reforms. They believed that China needed to study Western technology more carefully, particularly in areas such as naval construction, artillery, and shipbuilding. Improving coastal defenses and modernizing parts of the military became topics of increasing interest among certain administrators. However, these discussions were far from simple. China's government was built upon long-standing traditions and institutions that had evolved over centuries. Many officials feared that adopting foreign methods too quickly might weaken the social and political order that the Qing Dynasty depended upon. As a result, reform efforts developed slowly and cautiously. While some military improvements were attempted, large-scale modernization did not occur immediately. The empire remained focused primarily on maintaining stability within its existing administrative structure. At the same time, the expansion of foreign trade continued changing life in the treaty ports. Cities such as Shanghai grew rapidly as merchants from multiple nations established commercial operations there. British traders remained influential, but American, French, and other European merchants soon followed. Foreign settlements appeared along the waterfront districts of several ports. Within these areas, foreign residents built warehouses, offices, churches, and homes. Streets were laid out according to Western designs, and new commercial institutions developed to support the expanding trade networks. These communities often operated with a degree of independence from the surrounding Chinese cities because of the legal arrangements established after the war. Foreign residents were frequently governed by the laws of their own countries rather than by Chinese courts. This system created districts where Western legal systems functioned alongside Chinese administration. For Chinese residents living near these settlements, the presence of foreign communities introduced both opportunities and challenges. Trade created new jobs for laborers, translators, merchants, and craftsmen who worked with foreign businesses. At the same time, cultural differences sometimes produced misunderstandings or disputes between Chinese citizens and foreign residents. Beyond the treaty ports, many parts of China continued to function much as they had before the war. Farmers worked the fields, regional markets operated according to long-standing customs, and local officials administered their districts through the familiar structures of Qing governance. In these areas, the changes brought by international trade were less visible. Yet, the broader political environment had undeniably shifted. Foreign powers now possessed greater influence in certain regions of China's coast. The network of treaty ports connected Chinese commerce more directly to global trade routes, and the presence of foreign diplomats and merchants created new forms of interaction between China and the outside world. Meanwhile, the opium trade itself continued to expand. Although the war had been sparked by disputes surrounding opium, the Treaty of Nanking did not eliminate the trade entirely. Merchants continued importing the drug through various commercial networks, and demand within China remained significant. This development troubled many Qing officials. They believed that opium use continued harming communities and weakening parts of the economy. Yet enforcing prohibitions against the drug had proven difficult even before the war, and the expanded foreign presence in treaty ports complicated enforcement further. The continued growth of the opium trade became one of several issues that strained relations between China and Western nations during the following decades. Other disagreements also emerged. Questions about tariffs, diplomatic protocol, and the treatment of foreign citizens sometimes produced disputes between Chinese authorities and foreign governments. Each side interpreted the agreements made after the war according to its own expectations and traditions. For Britain and other Western powers, the treaties represented legal contracts that guaranteed specific rights for trade and diplomacy. For the Qing government, the agreements were often viewed as temporary arrangements made under difficult circumstances, rather than permanent changes to the empire's traditional policies. These different interpretations occasionally produced tension. Incidents involving merchants, missionaries, or local authorities sometimes escalated into diplomatic disputes that required negotiation between governments. Despite these challenges, the period after the First Opium War also saw remarkable growth in international commerce. Ships traveled regularly between Chinese ports and trading centers in Europe, India, and Southeast Asia. Goods such as tea, silk, and porcelain continued reaching global markets. While foreign manufactured products began appearing more frequently in Chinese cities, the expansion of maritime trade gradually integrated parts of China's economy into wider global networks. For merchants and traders, these changes created new opportunities for profit and cooperation across national boundaries. At the same time, the war had left a lasting impression on both sides. For Britain, the conflict had demonstrated the effectiveness of naval power in securing commercial and diplomatic objectives overseas. For China, the war had revealed the growing influence of industrialized nations and the challenges of adapting to this new international environment. The experience would shape Chinese policy debates for many years. Some officials continued advocating cautious reforms aimed at strengthening the empire. Others focused on preserving traditional institutions while managing foreign relations as carefully as possible. The path forward was uncertain. China remained one of the world's largest and most complex societies, governed by an imperial system that had endured for centuries. Yet, the events of the early 1840s had introduced forces that would gradually reshape how the empire interacted with the rest of the world. As the decades passed, new conflicts and negotiations would arise from the same issues first revealed during the First Opium War. The story of that conflict, therefore, did not end entirely with the signing of the Treaty of Nanking. Instead, it marked the beginning of a longer chapter in Chinese history, one in which the empire would confront the challenges of a rapidly changing global landscape. By the mid-9th century, the effects of the First Opium War had begun to settle into the daily rhythms of Chinese life. The cannons had fallen silent. British warships had withdrawn from many of the positions they once occupied, and trade had resumed along the coast. Yet the world that emerged after the Treaty of Nanking was not the same as the one that had existed before the conflict. The war had altered the structure of China's relationship with the outside world. For centuries, the Qing Empire had managed foreign commerce through a carefully controlled system centered on Canton. Foreign traders operated under strict regulations and were expected to follow the rules set by Chinese officials. That system had allowed the empire to maintain a sense of authority over international trade within its borders. After 1842, however, that structure had changed. The opening of multiple treaty ports meant that foreign merchants could now conduct business in several cities. Along the coast, ships carrying goods from distant parts of the world appeared regularly in harbors that had once been visited only by regional vessels. International trade became a visible and permanent feature of life in these ports. Shanghai soon stood out as the most prominent example of this transformation. What had once been a regional trading town quickly grew into a busy center of global commerce. Warehouses lined the riverbanks, storing goods arriving from across the world. Foreign merchants established offices that connected Chinese markets with trading houses in Europe, India, and Southeast Asia. The city's harbor filled with ships flying many different flags. British vessels remained the most numerous, but ships from the United States, France, and other nations also arrived regularly. The presence of these international traders created a unique environment where Chinese merchants, foreign sailors, translators, bankers, and laborers interacted daily. Similar developments occurred in other treaty ports. Sam'an, Fuzhou, and Ningbo gradually expanded their trading districts, and Canton itself continued serving as an important gateway for commerce in southern China. The network of ports created by the Treaty of Nanking formed a new link between China and the global economy. For many merchants, these changes brought opportunity. Trade expanded as goods moved more easily between China and overseas markets. Tea shipments continued traveling toward Europe, while foreign manufactured products began appearing more frequently in Chinese cities. Yet alongside these economic opportunities came growing concerns within the Qing government. The war had revealed weaknesses in the empire's coastal defenses and military organization. Some officials feared that if China did not strengthen its institutions, further conflicts with foreign powers might follow. Debates within the imperial court increasingly focused on how the empire should respond to this new international environment. Certain officials believed that China needed to study Western technology and military practices more carefully. They argued that understanding modern artillery, shipbuilding, and industrial methods might help the empire defend itself more effectively. Others preferred a more cautious approach. They believed that preserving traditional administrative systems remained essential for maintaining social stability across the vast territories of the Qing Empire. Sudden changes, they warned, might create internal unrest or weaken the authority of the government. These debates would continue shaping Chinese policy throughout the decades that followed. Meanwhile, foreign influence within the treaty ports continued expanding. Missionaries established churches and schools where new ideas about religion and education were introduced. Merchants brought different financial practices and commercial organizations into the trading cities. Cultural exchanges gradually occurred as Chinese residents encountered foreign customs, languages, and technologies. The process was complex and often uneven. In some areas, cooperation developed between Chinese and foreign merchants who worked together to expand trade. In other places, tensions arose when legal systems, social expectations, or economic competition produced disagreements. One issue that continued troubling Qing officials was the persistence of the opium trade. Despite the conflict that had erupted over the drug, opium imports into China did not disappear after the war. In fact, the expanding network of international commerce sometimes made it easier for merchants to transport the substance into Chinese markets. Officials who had long opposed the trade remained concerned about its social effects. They continued attempting to regulate or restrict the drug, although enforcement remained difficult within the complex environment of treaty ports and international shipping routes. Thus, the legacy of the war remained visible in many aspects of Chinese society. Politically, the Qing Empire had been forced to accept a new form of diplomacy with Western nations. Economically, the treaty ports connected China more directly with global trade networks. Socially, the presence of foreign communities along the coast introduced new cultural influences and interactions. For Britain, the war had achieved its immediate objectives. The Treaty of Nanking secured compensation for the destroyed opium cargo and opened new markets for British commerce. The acquisition of Hong Kong created a permanent base from which British merchants could operate in East Asia. Over time, Hong Kong developed into one of the busiest ports in the region. Ships traveling between Europe, India, and China passed through its harbor regularly. Warehouses, docks, and commercial offices expanded across the island, transforming it into a major center of maritime trade. The First Opium War therefore marked more than a single military conflict. It represented a moment when two very different systems, one rooted in traditional imperial governance and the other shaped by industrial expansion and global commerce, collided along the Chinese coast. The war did not immediately transform China into a modern industrial state, nor did it erase the long traditions of the Qing Empire. But it did open a period in which foreign powers gained increasing influence in certain parts of the country. Historians would later look back on the conflict as one of the early turning points in China's 19th century history. The events that began with disputes over opium shipments in Canton eventually reshaped trade routes, diplomatic relationships, and political debates throughout the region. Yet for the people who lived through those years, the story was experienced in quieter ways. A merchant watching unfamiliar ships enter the harbor, a local official reading reports of distant battles along the coast, a sailor navigating waters that had suddenly become part of an international conflict. These moments formed the human side of a much larger historical transformation. And as the 19th century continued unfolding, the lessons of the First Opium War would echo through future decisions made by leaders in both China and the Western world. The cannons had fallen silent in 1842. But the story of how trade, empire, and technology reshaped the relationship between nations was only just